I never thought I would end up sitting alone in a small apartment, staring at a photograph of my son, feeling a weight in my chest that I can't shake. It's a quiet, gray afternoon. The kind of day when the world seems paused, except for the faint hum of a heater somewhere down the hall. The photo is old. Him, maybe 6 or 7, smiling at me with eyes so full of trust and warmth that it hurts to look at them now. That boy doesn't know me anymore. That boy refuses to say my name. And every day, that silence presses down on me like a storm cloud that never moves. I remember the day I left with perfect clarity. Rain was falling in steady sheets, the kind that soaks you to the bone before you even realize it. My wife was in the kitchen, washing dishes, humming softly to herself. My son sat on the living room floor, playing with his little toy cars. I remember the way the light fell across the carpet, the smell of dinner in the air, the sound of the faucet dripping. And I left. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't hug them. I didn't explain anything. I just walked out, and the sound of that door shutting behind me, it has haunted me every day since. At the time, I had reasons, or so I told myself. I needed space. I needed to breathe. Life had become a weight I didn't know how to carry. Bills, work, arguments. They had piled up so high that I couldn't see past them. I convinced myself that leaving would somehow help. That absence might heal something I didn't even understand. I thought I was doing the right thing. But now I know the truth. Absence doesn't heal. Absence destroys. For the first few months, I clung to a quiet hope. I imagined my son understanding me one day. I imagined my wife forgiving me. I imagined all of us finding a way back to each other, as if a little distance could make love grow stronger. But reality is not imagination. Reality is harsher. Reality doesn't wait for you to feel ready. Reality moves on without you, and the people you love, they move on too, in ways you never expect. I tried calling, I tried writing. Letters piled up in my drawer, unread, unanswered. Every attempt at connection was met with silence. I began to understand, in the most painful way, that I wasn't wanted. My son didn't need me, my wife didn't want me, and the life I had left behind continued without me. It's a feeling so sharp it cuts into your chest and doesn't let go. I remember thinking, maybe if I wait, they'll come looking for me. But nobody came. And in that silence, I began to realize that I wasn't just physically absent. I was becoming invisible in their lives. A stranger, a man they once knew, but no longer recognized. There were moments, in the first year, when I almost returned. I would drive past our old street, slowing down in front of our house, hoping to see him through the curtains, hoping he might run to the door. But I never did. I couldn't. Pride, shame, fear, all of it kept me in the car, gripping the steering wheel, pretending I could disappear without consequence. And every time I drove away, the weight of what I had done pressed down harder. I remember one day, months after I had left, my wife answered the phone. Her voice was cold, distant. "I don't want you here," she said. Then she hung up. And just like that, the thin thread of hope I had held on to snapped. It wasn't just rejection, it was finality. And the realization hit me like a physical blow. I had walked out on the people who mattered most in my life, and there was no turning back. Sometimes I think about that last moment with my son. I remember him holding a little action figure in his hands, eyes wide with trust, looking at me as if I was the center of his world. And I walked away. I left him holding that toy, as if my leaving would somehow protect him from the pain I was about to feel. But I didn't protect him. I left a wound, and that wound never healed. Now, years later, the memory of that day is sharp, like a photograph pressed into my mind. I can see the rain streaking down the windows, the way his little hands clutched that toy car, the soft hum of my wife's voice in the background. And I realize, painfully, that no excuse, no justification, no reasoning can erase the damage that was done that day. Every day, I carry the regret like a physical weight. I replay the moments I missed: birthday parties, school plays, soccer games, bedtime stories. The little things, the moments that form a lifetime, are the ones I lost. And now, when I try to reach out, all I encounter is silence. He doesn't call me. He doesn't write. He doesn't respond. And every unanswered message, every ignored call, feels like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. I've often wondered if he even remembers me. Not just my name, but me. The man I was trying to be. The father I wanted to be. I remember teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway, holding onto the seat, running alongside him as he wobbled and fell. I remember the bedtime stories, the late-night talks, the laughter that once filled our home. And sometimes, late at night, I can almost hear his laughter echoing in the apartment, a ghost of the life I left behind. I don't tell anyone these things. Most people don't want to hear a man confess that he walked out on his own child. There's shame in it, deep, unrelenting shame. It sits in your chest, your stomach, your bones. It never goes away. And so I sit here, telling you, because maybe if you hear this story, you will understand how fragile love is. How easy it is to destroy something by walking away. Sometimes I drive past the neighborhood where we lived. The house is still there, paint faded, garden overgrown. I imagine him running to the door, shouting my name, throwing his arms around me. And then reality hits. He's not that boy anymore. He's taller, stronger, older, and I am just a stranger looking in. The man he calls Dad doesn't exist in his life anymore. I try reaching him. I call. I message. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine him lying awake, hearing the buzz of a phone, wondering who it is. Maybe he knows it's me. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know. I don't know if he'll ever forgive me. And maybe I don't deserve forgiveness. All I know is the ache, the emptiness, the regret that follows me like a shadow I cannot shake. And in this quiet, in this long, gray afternoon, I am left with memories and what-ifs. I am left with the echoes of a life I abandoned. I am left with hope so fragile it could be blown away by a single gust of wind. And yet, I cannot give up on that hope, because it is all I have. Some nights, I lie awake and think about all the small things I took for granted when I had them. The smell of my son's hair after a bath. The way he would hide under the blanket and whisper, "Daddy, tell me a story." The way his little hands would grip mine as we walked to the park, his steps trying to keep pace with mine, but never quite managing it. Those little moments, tiny, fragile, beautiful, they are gone now. Gone because I thought I needed to be somewhere else. I try to picture him as he is today. He must be taller than me now, stronger, more confident. I wonder what he looks like when he laughs, if he laughs often. I wonder if he remembers the bedtime stories, the small, silly jokes we used to share. I wonder if he even thinks about me at all. And every time I ask myself these questions, a sharp emptiness opens inside me. It's a hollow feeling, like reaching for something that doesn't exist anymore. I remember my wife's face the last time I saw it clearly. Not just the shape, not just the color, but the way she looked at me with a mix of hurt, disappointment, and something I can't quite name. I left so quietly that she didn't even have time to scream, to beg me to stay, to cry and plead. I left in silence, and the silence after my departure was worse than anything she could have said. It stretched on for months, years, and I am still trapped in it. There were times when I tried to imagine the reasons I left. Maybe I was looking for freedom. Maybe I thought I was protecting them from my anger, from my mistakes, from the man I was at that moment. But no matter how I justify it, I know now that I abandoned them. I abandoned my own child. I abandoned the woman I loved. And there is no excuse that can undo that. I remember the first birthday I missed after I left. I had a gift ready, a small model car for my son, the one he had been talking about for weeks. I placed it carefully in a box, wrote a note, and left it on the porch of the house, hoping someone would see it. When I drove away, I imagined him opening it, smiling, and thinking of me. But he never did. The gift sat there, untouched, maybe even thrown away, and I drove home alone, thinking I had done something good. But the truth is, it was meaningless. Because absence makes everything meaningless. There are times when I hear the echoes of my own life. A song on the radio, a phrase in a movie, the sound of children laughing somewhere outside. It all takes me back, whether I want it to or not. And every memory carries the weight of 1,000 what-ifs. What if I had stayed? What if I had tried harder? What if I had spoken the words I couldn't bring myself to say? I think about the mornings we spent together. Waking up, making breakfast, trying to get out the door on time. I remember rushing him to school when he was late, watching him run down the driveway with his little backpack bouncing on his shoulders. I remember the smell of pancakes, the sound of the coffee brewing, the soft light filtering through the kitchen window. Those were ordinary days, but they were ours. And I gave them up. Sometimes I imagine the life he has now. I wonder what he eats for breakfast, what music he listens to, if he has friends he trusts. I imagine him laughing with them, joking, growing into the man I should have helped him become. And with every image, I feel the loss even more sharply. Because I am not part of it. I am a stranger in the life that I once owned. I remember the first time I realized that leaving wasn't temporary. I thought I could step away, find clarity, and then return. But as the days turned into weeks, weeks into months, I began to understand a terrifying truth. Some wounds cannot be undone. Some absences cannot be filled. My leaving was permanent in their hearts, whether I accepted it or not. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when I considered showing up at the door, standing there and asking to be let back in. But every time, my feet froze. Pride, fear, shame, and the memory of my son's little eyes looking up at me, the last memory I had, held me back. Because I knew, deep down, that my presence might not be welcome, that my son might not want me anymore, that the man I once was might be gone for good. I remember one rainy evening, about a year after I left, driving past our old neighborhood. The house was familiar, yet different. Paint peeling in places, a new car parked in the driveway, the garden unkempt. I slowed the car, imagining my son peeking through the window, recognizing me, running out to me. But there was no one. Just the hum of rain on the asphalt, the soft splash of tires and puddles. And in that silence, I realized the full weight of my choices. The world had continued. Life had gone on, and I was no longer part of it. Every day, I carry the memories with me. They are constant companions, reminding me of the warmth I gave up, the trust one betrayed, the love I abandoned. And yet, even in this relentless guilt, there is a fragile hope. A hope that maybe, someday, my son will remember me, will speak my name, will see me not as the man who left, but as the father who always loved him, even when I failed. I don't speak of this to others. People don't want to hear it. They don't want to sit with a man who abandoned his own child and still cries for what he lost. But I am telling you now because someone has to understand the danger of walking away from love. Because sometimes, in the quiet, you realize that the choice to leave is the choice to destroy, and it cannot be undone. I remember teaching him to ride his bike. The way his little legs wobbled, the way he laughed, the way he would shout, "Faster, Dad, faster." And I would run behind him, gripping the back of the seat, sweating and smiling, feeling the joy of being a father. That joy, I left it behind. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the echoes of his laughter in my apartment. A sound that isn't really there, but feels real enough to break me. I close my eyes and imagine him calling my name, and I can almost feel his arms around me. And then I remember the truth. He won't call my name. Not yet. Not perhaps ever. And the ache that follows is unbearable. I think about my wife too. Her voice, her smile, the way she used to look at me with love and patience. And I think about the arguments, the silent dinners, the moments when I could have spoken but chose not to. I think about the last words we exchanged, or rather, the last words I failed to speak. And I realized that leaving was not freedom. Leaving was a cage of guilt and regret. Sometimes, I try to imagine a world where I didn't leave, where I stayed, where I tried harder, where I held him a little longer, kissed her forehead, and stayed present. And in that world, there is warmth, love, and laughter. And in this world, there is only cold, quiet, and the endless echo of my mistakes. Sometimes I sit quietly and try to remember the little details, the tiny moments that made our family life feel alive. I remember the sound of his shoes tapping on the hardwood floor in the morning as he rushed to get ready for school. I remember the smell of cereal and toast drifting from the kitchen while my wife read the newspaper, her glasses sliding down her nose. I remember the soft way he would hug me around my knees when he wanted comfort, his little arms barely strong enough to hold on. Those moments seemed so small, so ordinary, yet they were everything. They were the heartbeat of our home, and I left them all behind. I left them for a promise I had made to myself, the promise that stepping away would make me whole. But stepping away didn't make me whole, it only hollowed me out. I can still hear the words he spoke the last time I raised my voice at him, though they weren't meant to hurt me. "Dad, you don't understand me," he said, his eyes wide, shining with a mixture of frustration and fear. And I thought I was protecting him by walking away. I thought I was sparing him from a man who had grown impatient, tired, and angry. But in reality, I was taking away the one person who needed me most. The quiet tension began to grow slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Small misunderstandings, unspoken words, The way his laughter grew softer around me. The way he started holding back when I tried to hug him. I didn't notice it at first. I was too busy with work, too busy with life, too busy with my own pride. And by the time I realized, the distance had already begun to settle between us. I remember one evening, sitting at the dinner table, my son staring down at his plate. I asked him about his day at school, and he shrugged. "Nothing," he said, and went back to eating. No laughter, no stories about his friends, no spark in his eyes. I felt something inside me shift, a quiet panic rising. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to reach him, how to bridge the gap I hadn't realized was widening. I tried. I really did. I tried to ask more questions, to listen more, to show him that I cared. But he would answer with short sentences, clipped and distant. And every time he spoke like that, I felt a little more powerless, a little more invisible. And slowly, I began to withdraw and return, thinking that if I gave him space, he might come to me. But space is a cruel teacher. It teaches silence, distance, and resentment. There were nights when I would lie awake in the dark, hearing him breathe softly in the room down the hall, wondering what was going on in his mind. Did he feel hurt? Confused? Angry? I didn't know, and I didn't ask. Pride kept me quiet, and fear held me back from stepping closer. And that silence, that quiet, terrible silence, became the thing that finally pushed me out the door. I convinced myself that leaving was an act of care, a way to save him from my imperfections. I told myself that he would forgive me one day, that my absence would teach him patience, resilience, understanding. But in truth, leaving was selfish. It was cowardice masquerading as wisdom. And the cost of that choice, the human cost, is something I feel every day. The first months after I left were unbearable. I thought I would feel free, liberated, unburdened. But instead, I felt nothing but emptiness. Nights were long and quiet, filled with echoes of the laughter and voices I had abandoned. I would reach for the phone to call him, to hear his voice, and then put it down, terrified of rejection. Every ring unanswered, every message ignored, reinforced the truth. I was no longer part of his life. I remember driving past our old neighborhood one rainy evening, my windshield streaked with drops that blurred my vision, just like the way my mind blurred the memory of that last goodbye. I slowed in front of our house, imagining my son looking out the window, recognizing me, calling my name. But there was no one. Only the faint light behind the curtains and the sound of rain hitting the pavement. And in that quiet moment, I understood the full magnitude of what I had done. It is strange how absence transforms memory. I remember the small gestures he made without realizing their significance. The way he would reach for my hand while walking through the park. The way he would lean on me when he was tired, trusting me completely. Those gestures were love in its purest form. And I left them behind. I left the warmth, the laughter, the trust. I left the very soul of our family. Some nights, I try to imagine what he might be thinking. Does he wonder about me at all? Does he remember my voice, my laugh, the way I used to read stories to him at night? Or am I a stranger now, a name that appears in memory only occasionally, like a half-forgotten dream? Every unanswered thought, every lost connection, deepens the ache in my chest. I think about my wife too, and the love we once shared. Her quiet patience, the way she would sit with me on the couch, her hand resting gently on mine, the understanding that needed no words. And I think about the arguments, the misunderstandings, the moments of silence that grew heavier with each passing day. I left her too, and I can feel her disappointment as sharply now as I did the day I walked away. Sometimes, I imagine a different life, a life where I stayed, where I tried harder, where I held my son a little longer, where I spoke words of love instead of walking away in silence. In that life, there is warmth, laughter, and connection. In this life, there is regret, emptiness, and the endless echo of what I abandoned. I have tried to fill the void in other ways, with work, with hobbies, with distractions. But nothing replaces the sound of your child calling your name. Nothing replaces the trust, the innocence, the bond that I traded for a temporary escape. Every day, I am reminded of the price of my choices, a price measured not in money or success, but in silence and absence. And still, in the midst of this relentless regret, a fragile hope remains. A hope that one day, my son will remember me, not the man who walked away, but the father who always loved him, even when I failed. A hope that maybe, just maybe, the sound of my voice calling his name will once again find a place in his heart. Until that day comes, I sit here, alone, listening to the quiet, thinking about the boy I left behind and the man he has become. I carry his memory with me, a constant companion, a reminder of what love really means, and what it costs when we fail to hold on to it. I think about mornings in our old home, and how the sun would spill through the windows just so. It would land on the carpet where my son would play, and I could see the light catching the edges of his hair as he concentrated on his little blocks or cars. He would hum a tune softly to himself, the kind of melody that felt like a secret he was sharing only with me. And I would watch, smiling, feeling that quiet pride that only a father knows. A pride so simple, so pure, yet so easily taken for granted. Breakfast was always a ritual of small chaos and quiet love. My wife would hum as she cooked, flipping pancakes, stirring cereal, filling mugs with steaming milk. My son would sometimes run late, shoes untied, hair messy, cheeks flushed with the rush of morning energy. I would kneel down, tie his shoes, tuck in his shirt, and guide him out the door, just a little bit longer than necessary, savoring the warmth of holding him close. Those mornings were ordinary, yet extraordinary in their simplicity, and I left them behind without a thought. I remember teaching him to ride his bike in the driveway. The seat was just the right height for him, and I held onto the back, running alongside him, my hand firm yet gentle. "Faster, Dad, faster," he would shout, grinning so wide that his joy became mine. Every wobble, every near fall, was met with laughter and encouragement. And then, when he finally found balance, when he pedaled alone down the street with the wind on his face, I felt a surge of pride that I can still recall vividly. That memory now feels like a lifetime ago, like it belongs to a world I can't return to. I think about bedtime, the quiet moments when the house grew still and we would settle into his room. He would pull the blanket tight around him and ask for stories, sometimes about pirates, sometimes about astronauts, sometimes about ordinary days turned extraordinary by imagination. I would sit by the edge of his bed, reading softly, sometimes improvising tales of courage and kindness, always ending with a reminder that I loved him. And I left those nights, those sacred rituals of closeness, behind. I remember the rainy days, too. Rain had a way of making the house feel smaller, warmer, and somehow more intimate. We would sit by the window, watching the drops race down the glass, listening to the rhythmic patter on the roof. I would pour him a cup of cocoa, and we would talk, quietly, about nothing in particular, letting the simple sound of conversation wrap us together. Those were the days I should have cherished most. And instead, I walked away. Even the little frustrations now feel like treasures in hindsight. The way he would complain about his homework, dragging his feet across the living room. The way he would ask the same questions over and over, testing my patience. The way he would challenge me with his clever observations, demanding attention, engagement, and love. Those small annoyances, those daily trials, were the heartbeat of our life. And I left them all behind, chasing a freedom that never truly existed. I remember one particular afternoon when he came home from school, rain dripping from his hair and jacket, eyes shining with excitement. He had learned a new word, he told me proudly, and he wanted to show me how he could write it down. He handed me the notebook, his little hand trembling slightly with anticipation. I looked at it, nodded, praised him, and felt the swelling pride of a father who sees his child grow. That moment was fleeting, yet it was everything. And I left moments like that behind, uncounted, unappreciated, unaware of the weight of what I was giving up. I think about the small celebrations we shared, birthdays, holidays, family dinners. I remember his first birthday cake, smeared with frosting on his cheeks, the way his eyes lit up as he clutched a small toy. I remember our attempts to carve pumpkins for Halloween, messy paint and laughter spilling over every surface. I remember our first Christmas together, the living room filled with wrapping paper and ribbons, the excitement in his voice as he unwrapped a present he had been wishing for all year. And yet, I left, abandoning all of it, thinking it wouldn't matter, thinking I could come back whenever I wanted. It is strange how absence reshapes memory. I can remember these moments vividly, more vividly than the struggles that existed alongside them. I remember the laughter, the warmth, the closeness, all the moments that truly defined my connection with him. and the silence that replaced them now is deafening. It is a silence that follows me everywhere, that settles into every quiet room, that makes even ordinary spaces feel empty. There were arguments, of course, moments when tempers flared, when I was too strict, when he disobeyed, when frustration rose on both sides. But even those moments now feel precious in memory. They were proof of life, proof of engagement, proof of love being tested and tried. And I left them behind, cutting the connection in a way that words cannot repair. Sometimes I imagine his laughter now, echoing somewhere in another home, with other people, untouched by the pain of my absence. I wonder if he still looks back, in some corner of his mind, remembering me as I remember him, or if he has erased me entirely, as if a life without a father is easier to live. And the thought of being forgotten by him, the boy who once clung to me, terrifies me more than any punishment I could ever face. I think about the notes he left for me as a small child. Little drawings, scribbled messages on scraps of paper, declarations of love that were simple, sincere, and pure. "I love you, Dad," they said, or "Don't go away." Sometimes, in shaky handwriting, words heavier than I could have known. I left without responding to any of them. I left them unanswered, unacknowledged, and the weight of that decision lingers in me like a shadow. I remember my wife's voice, quiet but firm, the last time she tried to reach me after I left. "You can't just walk away," she said. And she was right. But I walked anyway. And every day since, I have felt the truth of those words pressing down on me. Love isn't something you step away from without consequence. Absence doesn't heal. Absence destroys. Sometimes I imagine walking back through the door, stepping into our home, and seeing him run to me, shouting my name. I imagine my wife smiling, forgiving me, our family whole again. But when I open my eyes, I am alone. And the silence presses in, heavier than rain on a tin roof, heavier than the memories that fill every corner of my mind. I have tried to reach him over the years, letters, calls, messages, small gestures meant to remind him I am here. But each attempt meets silence. And silence is a cruel teacher. It teaches absence, distance, and despair. Every unanswered call, every unopened letter, confirms the truth I have feared all along. I am no longer part of his life. And the ache of that truth follows me like a shadow that cannot be shaken. And yet, in the midst of this regret, a fragile hope remains. A hope that one day, he will remember the moments we shared. That he will remember the sound of my voice, the warmth of my hand, the way I laughed with him, cried with him, and loved him fiercely, even when I failed him. That he will remember me, not just as the man who left, but as the father who always loved him, even when I walked away. I remember one evening vividly, sitting on the old porch of our house before I left, watching the sun sink behind the rooftops. The sky was painted in oranges and deep purples, and I remember thinking it was the kind of beauty that should be shared. I should have shared it with them, my wife, my son, but I sat there alone, silent, pretending I was thinking about life, about the future, about possibilities. I was thinking, of course, about escape, about leaving, about stepping out into a world that I imagined would be lighter, freer, easier. I had no idea what I was leaving behind. I remember the sound of his laughter carried on the wind as he played with his toy trucks in the yard. I remember his small voice calling out, "Dad, watch this." I remember the way his tiny hands gripped the wheel of a plastic truck, how seriously he took that little game, how proud he was when I cheered for him. And I left him there, laughing, trusting, hoping I would stay, and I walked away. The irony of it all is that I left thinking I was saving him from my flaws. I left thinking I needed space to become better, to figure things out, to somehow become the father he deserved. But leaving them, was the cruelest, most selfish thing I ever did. The moment I stepped away, I realized, too late, that love is not something you step away from. Love demands presence, consistency, and patience, even when it is hard. I remember the quiet mornings after I had gone, when my absence became a dull ache in the house. My wife would sit at the kitchen table, her coffee cold, staring at the doorway I once entered every day. My son would sometimes wander into the room, glance at the empty chair where I used to sit, and then go back to his toys. There was no anger in him, no rage. Just confusion. Just the quiet, sharp understanding that someone he loved had abandoned him. The first night alone in that apartment after leaving was the longest night of my life. I couldn't sleep. I tried, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. I saw him playing, smiling, trusting me completely. I saw her, alone in the kitchen, her hands pressed together, her face set with quiet determination to keep the family running. And I felt the emptiness of my own choice pressing in on me. I thought I could outrun guilt. I thought that if I kept moving, kept busy, kept my mind occupied, the pain of leaving would fade. But it never does. Guilt isn't something you escape. Guilt follows you like a shadow. And regret grows heavier with every day that passes, every year that stretches beyond your reach. I think about the first holiday I missed after leaving, Thanksgiving. I remember imagining the smell of turkey roasting, the chatter of family around the table, the little jokes and laughter that filled our home. I imagined my son's face lighting up as he recounted something funny that happened at school, the way he would look at me for validation, for pride, for love. And I wasn't there. Not for the laughter, not for the warmth, not for the connection that I had abandoned. Sometimes, I try to imagine what he might be thinking now, years later. Does he remember me? Does he even want to remember? Or have I become a shadow in his mind, a ghost of a father he once had but no longer knows? Every thought is unbearable. Every imagined scenario carries a mix of hope and dread. Hope that maybe he does remember, dread that he might have forgotten entirely. I remember the small notes he used to leave for me as a child. Scribbles on scraps of paper, simple drawings, little messages that said, "I love you, Dad," or "Please don't go." I never saw most of them until after I had left. And when I did, they sat in a drawer, unopened, untouched, reminders of love that I had failed to acknowledge, gestures of trust one had abandoned. Even now, years later, I sometimes sit with a pen and paper and try to write to him. I try to explain myself, to express the love I still feel, to beg for forgiveness I may never receive. But most of the time, I can't. Words feel meaningless after absence. Words cannot undo silence, cannot undo distance, cannot undo the fact that I walked away. I remember one rainy afternoon when I tried to imagine returning. I drove past our old street, my windshield streaked with raindrops, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly it hurt. I imagined him looking through the curtains, recognizing me, running to the door with a shout, throwing his arms around me. I imagined my wife's quiet forgiveness, the warmth of our family restored. And then I drove past, unable to stop, because the truth was waiting for me, a truth I wasn't ready to face. He might not run. He might not recognize me. He might not want me anymore. There are nights, long nights, when I lie awake imagining what he is doing. I picture him at school, laughing with friends, talking with teachers, living a life that I am no longer a part of. I picture him growing taller, stronger, learning new things, forming memories without me. And I am outside it all, a stranger to the life I should have been part of. I remember the last words I said to my wife. Or, more accurately, the words I didn't say. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I didn't say, "I love you. I'm sorry, I need help." I left quietly, hoping perhaps that absence would teach us all something. And in that quiet, I lost everything. I have tried to fill the void in other ways. Work, distractions, routines. But nothing replaces a father's presence. Nothing replaces the laughter, the small victories, the everyday life that builds trust and love over years. Nothing replaces being there when a child needs you. And every day, I am reminded of what I lost. And still, in the depth of all this regret, a small, fragile hope remains. Hope that one day, my son will remember. Hope that one day, he might speak my name. Hope that one day, he will see the father who loved him, even when he walked away. It is a hope so fragile it could shatter with a single rejection. And yet, I cling to it, because it is all I have. Somewhere, deep in my heart, I know the truth. I can never undo the past. I can never reclaim the days I missed, the moments I abandoned, the trust one broke. But I can try. I can hope. I can be present now, in whatever way I am allowed, and carry forward the lessons I have learned too late. Every day, I carry him with me, in my memory, in my thoughts, in the quiet corners of my mind. And I hope that one day, he will carry me in his as well. I remember the sound of his little footsteps running across the hallway, chasing after a ball, chasing after laughter, chasing after life with an energy I could never match. Those steps used to echo in my heart, a constant reminder that I mattered to someone, that I was needed, that I had a purpose beyond work, beyond myself. And then I left. I left, and the echo vanished. The hallway stayed empty. The sound of life continued, somewhere else, without me. I think about the first time he cried without me there to comfort him. It was something small, a scraped knee, a broken toy. But it was enough to break my heart when I heard about it later. I wasn't there to wipe his tears, to hold him close, to whisper that everything would be okay. I wasn't there, and in that absence, I learned a lesson I can never forget. Leaving doesn't spare anyone pain. It only multiplies it. I remember the afternoons we spent in the park. He would run ahead of me, daring me to catch him, daring me to play, daring me to laugh and forget the weight of the world. I would chase him, feeling my own worries slip away, replaced by joy, by pride, by a sense of belonging I never knew I could feel. And I left that behind, walking away from the purest happiness I had ever known. I remember bedtime rituals in detail, the way he would insist on a story before sleep, the soft breathing after I kissed his forehead, the gentle rise and fall of his chest as he drifted off. Those moments were mine to protect, to cherish, to hold on to forever. And I left them, stepping out into a life that promised freedom but delivered only emptiness. I think about his first day of school. He clutched my hand tightly as we walked up the steps, looking nervous, looking brave, looking at me with eyes that searched for reassurance. I remember kneeling down, telling him he could do it, that I believed in him, that I would always be there. And then I left. And after I left, there were no more hands to hold, no more eyes looking for guidance, no more reassurance from the father who should have stayed. I remember the way he would sometimes climb onto my lap uninvited, needing nothing but the warmth of my presence. And I would hold him, feeling the weight of his trust, feeling the responsibility of being his father, feeling the purest form of love there is. And I left that behind. I left that trust, that warmth, that love, in exchange for the illusion of escape. I think about the holidays, the way he would help decorate the tree, the way he would carefully unwrap ornaments, place them just so, and step back to admire his work. I remember baking cookies together, flour on his nose, laughter spilling over the kitchen counter. And I left that. I left the simple, ordinary beauty of life that no one else could replicate, because I didn't realize it was irreplaceable. I remember the small lessons I taught him, the little skills that were meant to prepare him for life. Tying shoes, riding a bike, tying knots, counting money, remembering to say thank you. And I left those moments too, abandoned them in the hands of a world that would teach him differently, a world that would teach him without me, without my guidance, without my love. Sometimes I think about the first time he learned something new, a word, a concept, a joke, and ran to me to share it, his face glowing with pride, eager for approval, eager for acknowledgement. I wasn't always patient, but I always tried to celebrate those moments with him. And then I left. I left him to celebrate with someone else, in someone else's presence, while I sat alone, carrying regret like a stone in my chest. I think about the small conversations we had at the dinner table, the way he would ask questions about everything he noticed, about the world, about life, about me. And I would answer as best I could, even when I didn't have the answers. And I left that behind. I left the curiosity, the questions, the connection that came from shared attention, shared patience, shared love. I remember the first time he asked me to help with homework. His little brow furrowed in concentration, his pencil trembling in his hand, his eyes pleading for guidance. I helped, explained, encouraged, praised. And I left that too, leaving him to struggle alone, learning lessons without my hands, my voice, my guidance. And I feel that loss every single day. I remember the first time he learned to swim. I was there, standing at the edge of the pool, holding on to him as he kicked and splashed, encouraging him, cheering him on, feeling pride that will never fade. And I left that behind. I left all the firsts, all the moments that define a childhood, all the milestones that a father should witness. I left them in a life that I could not be part of. I remember the evenings when we would sit together, doing puzzles, drawing pictures, building little creations from blocks. I remember the quiet concentration on his face, the way he would ask for help when he needed it, the way he would beam when a puzzle piece fit perfectly. And I left that behind too, abandoning the joy, the discovery, the shared triumphs. I remember the way he would sometimes fall asleep in my lap, tiny snores escaping his mouth, his small body rising and falling with each breath, completely trusting me to protect him. And I left that too, the trust, the safety, the intimacy of a father's presence. I walked away and let it all vanish. And now, sitting here alone, years later, the weight of all these memories presses down on me. Every laugh I missed, every tear I didn't wipe, every hug I didn't give, they form a chain around my heart, a chain I cannot break. I hear echoes of his voice in the quiet moments, shadows of his laughter in the empty rooms I occupy, ghosts of his presence haunting every corner of my mind. I try to imagine a future where perhaps he remembers me, where he might forgive me, where he might still need me in some small way. But I also know the reality, that absence is difficult to undo, that trust takes years to rebuild, that love can be fragile, and that sometimes the people we love the most can grow distant beyond reach. And yet, in the deepest part of me, hope still lingers. Fragile, quiet, nearly invisible, but persistent. Hope that one day, my son will see me again, will hear my voice, will allow me to be part of his life once more. Hope that he might call my name, just once, and the sound will fill the empty spaces I have carried for years. Hope that I can still be a father, even if I failed in the past. Until that day, I live with my memories, my regrets, and my love. I live with the echo of footsteps I once followed, laughter I once shared, and warmth I once held. And I carry the knowledge that love is not measured by distance, but by persistence, by presence, by the willingness to keep trying, even when the world tells you it is too late. And so I wait. I remember. I hope. And I hold on to the faint, fragile belief that one day, my son will see me not as the man who walked away, but as the father who never stopped loving him, even in my absence. Before everything fell apart, our home was small, messy, ordinary, and perfect in its simplicity. It wasn't a mansion or a showpiece, just a modest house on a quiet street, with peeling paint on the front steps and a garden that my wife tended with quiet devotion. Every morning, the sun would slip through the curtains of our living room, lighting up the room in a golden haze, and our little family would wake slowly to the rhythm of our life. I would hear my son first, the soft shuffle of his feet on the carpet, the creak of the bedroom door, the faint whisper of his voice saying, "Dad, are you awake?" I would open my eyes and see him standing there, hair messy, eyes wide with curiosity and energy, and I would feel a pang of happiness that never lasted long enough. I would lift him into my arms, feeling his warmth, feeling the connection we shared, feeling the quiet, sacred responsibility of being a father. Breakfast was chaotic in the best way. My wife humming as she flipped pancakes, the smell of coffee filling the kitchen, my son chattering endlessly about the things he had seen at school. I would sit at the table, stirring my coffee slowly, smiling as he recounted a joke or a story that made him laugh uncontrollably. And in those moments, I felt like the luckiest man alive, though I didn't always know it then. Our dinners were noisy, sometimes stressful, sometimes filled with arguments over spilled milk or homework forgotten. But there was love in the noise. There was warmth in the chaos. We would talk, laugh, and occasionally raise our voices, but there was always a thread of connection that ran through it all. It was the kind of family life that feels ordinary when you're living it, but extraordinary when you look back. Weekends were even better. Saturday mornings meant pancakes with extra syrup, messy hands, sticky fingers, laughter echoing through the house. We would go to the park, my son insisting I push him on the swings, urging me to go higher, faster, until we were both breathless with laughter. And then there were the quiet moments, sitting together under a tree, watching clouds drift lazily across the sky, talking about nothing and everything at the same time. Those were the moments that built trust, connection, and love, brick by brick, memory by memory. I taught him small lessons, not always consciously, but always with care. How to tie his shoes, how to ride a bike, how to help with chores, how to be kind to others, how to notice the world around him. I would guide him gently, correcting him when necessary, praising him when he succeeded, and holding him when he failed. He trusted me completely, and I felt the weight and joy of that trust every single day. My wife and I had our own rhythm, our own quiet understanding. We weren't perfect. We argued about money, about chores, about the way to raise our son. But even in those disagreements, there was a deep bond, a commitment to each other and to our family. She had a way of looking at me, of listening, of supporting, that made me feel understood, loved, and seen. And I often took it for granted, caught up in my own thoughts, my own worries, my own sense of responsibility. Evenings were calm. My son would take a bath, and I would sit on the edge of the tub, watching him splash, helping him rinse off, laughing at the way he made messes everywhere. Afterward, I would help him into pajamas, brush his hair, and read him a story, sometimes one we made up together, sometimes one from a book. And I would kiss his forehead, tuck him in, and watch him drift off to sleep, feeling the satisfaction of a day well lived, a connection well tended. Holidays and special occasions were magical. Birthdays meant cake, candles, and presents. Yes, but also love poured into the smallest details. The way he arranged the wrapping paper, the way my wife baked with care, the way I tried to make each moment memorable. Christmas was my favorite, with decorations scattered across the house, lights twinkling, and the excitement in his eyes palpable as he unwrapped gifts. And even the little things, a hand-drawn card, a scribbled note saying, "I love you, Dad," carried a weight far beyond their size. I tried to be there for every milestone. First lost tooth, first soccer goal, first day at school, first science project. Every first mattered, and I wanted to witness each one. I wanted to be the father who was present, who celebrated, who guided, who supported. And I mostly succeeded, though I didn't always recognize how fleeting those moments were, how fragile the bond we were building could be. Our home was filled with laughter, with small victories, with quiet routines that became rituals. The smell of pancakes, the sound of his voice, the clatter of toys, the laughter of my wife, all of it formed a rhythm, a heartbeat that made our family life feel steady, safe, and alive. And it was within that rhythm that the seeds of tension had not yet begun to grow, the cracks in our connection not yet visible. There were signs, small and subtle, of what was to come. A look of frustration on his face when I was late for school drop-off. A sigh when I raised my voice over something trivial. A glance from my wife when I forgot to do something I promised. But those signs were easy to dismiss at the time. We were happy, in our own imperfect way. The quiet tensions were just whispers beneath the sound of love and laughter. I remember one rainy Saturday, sitting in the living room, rain pattering against the windows, my son curled up next to me with a book. My wife brought in hot cocoa, and we sat together, silent, savoring the quiet comfort of home. It felt like the world could never intrude on this bubble of peace, this sanctuary of love. And yet, that calm, ordinary happiness was fragile, more fragile than I realized. I think back now and realize that in these ordinary days, we were laying the groundwork for connection, for trust, for lifelong bonds. Every hug, every shared laugh, every quiet word of encouragement mattered. And yet, I failed to see how delicate it all was. I failed to recognize that love is something that must be tended to every single day, in every small act, in every presence, in every choice. Those days before the conflict were filled with life, ordinary, chaotic, imperfect, but full of warmth and belonging. They were the days that taught me the meaning of love, of responsibility, of connection. And I left them, stepping out into the world with a false sense of freedom, unaware that the true cost of leaving would echo through every quiet room, every empty hallway, every unanswered question, and every missed moment of my son's life. Even now, years later, when I replay those memories, I can feel the weight of what I had, and the greater weight of what I lost. Those ordinary days, filled with small, perfect moments, are gone. But in memory, they remain vivid, haunting, and bittersweet, a reminder of what family truly is and how fragile it can be when neglected. Even in the happiest homes, small cracks start forming long before anyone notices them. In ours, the cracks were quiet at first, almost imperceptible, like tiny lines forming in a porcelain cup. I didn't see them. I didn't recognize the subtle changes, the little shifts in my son's gaze, the slight hesitation in his voice, or the way my wife's smile sometimes carried an unspoken weight. It started with small frustrations. I would come home late from work, exhausted, and my son would ask for help with something, and I would snap, my patience thinner than it should have been. Not now, I would say, not realizing how my tone cut deeper than I could see. He would retreat, muttering under his breath, his little shoulders slumping. I would apologize later, of course, but the damage lingered in silence, a silence that started to grow between us. There were mornings when I noticed his eyes avoiding mine. He would hurry through breakfast, barely speaking, and I could feel a distance creeping in. I didn't understand it at the time. I thought it was just his mood, just childhood stubbornness. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of a wall being built silently, brick by brick, between a father and his son. My wife noticed too, and she tried to guide me. "He's changing, you know," she would say gently. "Try to ask him about his day. Don't just assume he'll tell you." I nodded, promising I would, but sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I was too tired, too caught up in my own world, too distracted to notice that the simplest questions could mean everything. I remember one afternoon when my son came home from school, frustrated and tearful. He had struggled with a math problem and wanted help. I was busy preparing dinner, my mind on a work deadline, and I said, "Figure it out yourself. You'll be fine." He looked at me, eyes wide, a mixture of confusion and hurt, and turned away quietly. That moment haunted me later that night, long after he had gone to bed. I realized then that I had failed not in big gestures, but in the small, everyday ways that truly mattered. There were times when he would ask me questions about life, about the world, about feelings, questions I couldn't answer, or perhaps didn't know how to. I would give vague answers, hoping it would be enough. "You'll understand someday," I would say. But sometimes, my words weren't enough, and I could see the disappointment in his eyes. It was subtle, quiet, but it was there. And it began to fester, unspoken, growing slowly, like a shadow stretching across our home. My wife and I had our own quiet struggles too. I didn't always notice how tired she was, how much she carried on her own, how much she shielded our son from my flaws. Sometimes I argued over things that didn't matter, my voice sharper than it should have been, my patience thinner than it needed to be. And each time, I saw her look at me with that mixture of frustration and love, trying to hold the family together while I was blind to my own failings. I remember one evening when my son asked me to come to his school play. He had been practicing for weeks, and his little face lit up with excitement. I had a work meeting, though, and I said no. I promised to make it up to him, of course, but the disappointment in his eyes stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed the look over and over, a quiet ache settling in my chest. It was one of the first real signs that I was slowly losing connection with him. Not because I didn't love him, but because I didn't always make the right choices to show it. There were other signs, too. A small sigh when I asked him to clean up his toys, a glance at my wife when I raised my voice, a hesitation in conversation. Small things, almost invisible, but they added up. The warmth and laughter that had once filled our home began to waver, replaced by quiet tension, unspoken frustrations, and moments of isolation that I failed to recognize in time. Even on weekends, when we tried to do things together, there were moments of strain. I would suggest a family activity, and he would respond with reluctance. I would notice a subtle resistance, a quiet pushback, and instead of asking gently why, I would grow impatient. "Come on, don't be difficult," I would say, and he would retreat, withdrawing into himself. Those moments felt small then, almost insignificant, but they were the first cracks of a larger divide that would eventually stretch into something I could not repair. I remember one afternoon when I tried to play catch with him in the yard. He tossed the ball half-heartedly, distracted, and I grew frustrated. "Put some effort into it," I said. He stopped, stared at me for a moment, and then walked away without a word. I called after him, but he didn't respond. My wife came to the door and gave me a look, the kind of look that said everything without words. And in that moment, I realized that connection is fragile. Even small moments of impatience can leave deep marks. Our home was still filled with love, yes. There were still hugs, laughter, and bedtime stories. But beneath it all, the subtle tensions were growing. Unspoken expectations, quiet disappointments, and small misunderstandings were weaving a web between us, invisible yet strong. And I failed to notice, failed to address, failed to nurture the bond that mattered more than anything. I tried to compensate with gestures, a weekend trip, a gift, an extra story at bedtime. But those moments, though well-intentioned, could not repair the slow erosion of trust, attention, and connection. The little things matter most, I realized too late, and I had let too many of them slip away unnoticed. I remember one rainy evening when my son and I sat by the window, watching the drops slide down the glass. He was quiet, unusually so, and I asked gently, "What's on your mind, buddy?" He hesitated, then said softly, "I don't know. You don't notice sometimes." His words hit me like a punch I wasn't ready for. I wanted to explain, to apologize, to promise I would do better, but all I could do was sit in silence and hold his hand. That silence was heavier than any argument, heavier than any punishment, heavier than anything I had ever felt. And in that silence, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. Love alone is not enough. Presence, attention, patience, and care are what make love real. And without them, even the strongest love can falter. Even the closest bond can fray. And I had been failing in all those small but critical ways, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the distance between us became undeniable. I remember talking with my wife late at night, long after our son had gone to bed. "I don't know if he feels close to us anymore," she said quietly, voice filled with concern. "He's changing, and I think we're letting him slip away." I nodded, but I didn't know what to say. The truth was, I was noticing it too late. I was seeing the cracks only after they had grown too wide to ignore. And the helplessness I felt in that moment was unbearable. Even now, when I recall those days, I realize that they were full of love, yes, but also of missed opportunities. Moments where a question could have been asked, where patience could have been extended, where attention could have been given, moments I ignored, overlooked, or dismissed. And each one built the invisible walls that would eventually divide us. I remember the laughter that still existed, the small victories, the bedtime stories, the shared games, the hugs and kisses. But alongside those moments, there was tension, misunderstandings, frustration, unspoken needs. And the combination of all these things, subtle yet insistent, began to create a distance that would grow into something I could not bridge. Those years before the conflict were precious, filled with ordinary routines and extraordinary love. But they were also fragile, delicate, and easily broken. And I didn't realize it until it was almost too late. As the years passed, those small cracks in our family began to grow more noticeable. Not dramatic, not sudden, but quiet, insidious. I started noticing the way my son sometimes hesitated before sharing something with me, the way his words trailed off, or how he would look to my wife for approval before speaking at all. I didn't always understand it at the time. I thought he was just growing up, learning to navigate the world, becoming independent. But looking back now, I see that those hesitations were not just signs of maturity. They were the beginnings of emotional distance. I remember one afternoon when he came to me holding a small project he had been working on for school. He looked proud, expecting a smile, a word of praise. But I was distracted, tired from work, my mind elsewhere. I glanced at it and said, "That's nice," without really looking. His face fell just slightly, a flicker of disappointment that he tried to hide. I didn't notice at the time, but that moment lingered in his heart. And moments like that, repeated quietly over the months and years, built a wall I didn't know how to break. Even my wife noticed. She tried to intervene gently, to remind me to pause, to engage, to really be present. "He needs you," she said one evening, her voice soft but firm. "He notices when you're not really there." I nodded, understanding the words, but I didn't always act on them. And each time I didn't, the subtle distance grew a little more. Our weekends, which had once been filled with laughter and connection, began to feel strained at times. We would plan family activities, trips to the park or the library, or simple afternoons playing games at home. But occasionally, I would see his reluctance. He would respond to suggestions with a quiet, "I guess," or he would wander off halfway through, leaving me standing there, unsure, feeling a faint emptiness I couldn't name. And I often brushed it off, thinking he was just distracted, or tired, or simply a child growing up. But it was more than that. I remember one Saturday, trying to teach him how to ride his bike without training wheels. He struggled, falling several times, and I encouraged him as best I could. But when he looked up at me with eyes that searched for reassurance, I was distracted. My mind was on work, on deadlines, on bills, on responsibilities. I said the wrong thing, impatiently. Just get on and do it already. He froze, confusion and hurt flickering across his face. I immediately regretted it, but the damage was done. He pedaled off reluctantly, and I watched him grow distant in that small moment, carrying a lesson in disappointment he didn't deserve. At dinner, I noticed the subtle changes too. He would answer in short sentences, no longer sharing every little detail of his day. The lively stories that once spilled from him like laughter had become guarded, cautious. And when he made a joke, I sometimes didn't notice it or laughed half-heartedly, distracted. I didn't realize that he was slowly learning that his words, his thoughts, his feelings might not always matter to me. There were mornings when I woke up late and found him sitting quietly in the living room, waiting for breakfast, waiting for me. He didn't complain, didn't ask, just sat there with a small, disappointed sigh. I remember feeling a twinge of guilt, but then brushing it aside, telling myself that he would understand someday. But that understanding was not enough. A child doesn't just need explanations. He needs presence, attention, love in every small act. And my absence, even in moments when I was physically there, left a subtle void. I remember a rainy afternoon when he came home from school, wet and tired, holding a certificate he had earned for a project. He was proud, excited, expecting me to celebrate with him. But I was on a call for work, and I said, "Can you show me later?" His shoulders slumped, a small but sharp pain in his expression. I promised to look at it later, but the later never came. And in that single overlooked moment, I unintentionally taught him that my priorities were elsewhere, that his achievements, his happiness, his small victories were secondary to my own distractions. My wife noticed these moments too. She tried to guide him gently, to encourage him to express himself, to maintain the connection that I was unintentionally neglecting. She would remind me, "He's still small. He needs you now. Don't wait until later." But I didn't always listen. I thought I was doing enough, thought I was present in my own way. And slowly, imperceptibly, the distance grew. Even in moments that should have been joyous, subtle tensions crept in. A game we played together became a competition, and I found myself frustrated at his mistakes. A story he told me ended with my distracted nod, instead of the laughter and engagement he craved. A simple question about his day was met with a rushed answer. All of these small actions, seemingly insignificant at the time, added up to a growing gap I didn't fully understand until it was already there. I noticed it most in his eyes. He would look at me, searching for connection, for understanding, for acknowledgement, and sometimes he found only distraction, frustration, or absence. And in those moments, I felt a quiet, gnawing guilt, a recognition that I was failing in ways I could not fully repair. Yet, I convinced myself I was doing my best. I convinced myself that life required hard choices and sacrifices, that work, that responsibility, that being a provider was enough. But it was not. It never was. There were also moments of rebellion, small but telling. He would avoid chores, resist instructions, or speak with a sharper tone than usual. He wasn't trying to hurt me, not consciously, but he was expressing frustration, confusion, and disappointment in the only ways he knew how. And my responses were often impatience or correction, rather than listening or empathy. Every moment like that widened the gap just a little more. I remember one quiet evening when I tried to apologize for something minor, trying to reconnect after a rough day. He shrugged and said softly, "It's fine, Dad," but his eyes held a distance I couldn't bridge. I realized then that apologies, no matter how sincere, cannot always repair the erosion caused by years of small neglect, quiet impatience, and emotional absence. And yet, in all this, love remained. I loved him fiercely, more than I could ever express. My wife and I loved him with all our hearts. But love alone is not enough. Presence, patience, attention, consistency, these are the real foundations of connection, and I had not always provided them. Even as these subtle cracks widened, there were moments of light. We would laugh together, play together, share quiet conversations that reminded me of the bond we once had. Those moments were fleeting, but they were precious. They were reminders of what we could have been, and what I still longed to restore, even as the distance between us grew. Looking back now, I understand that these years before the real conflict were a delicate balancing act. Love was there, always, but it was fragile. Patience was sometimes absent. Attention was inconsistent. And the combination of these things, small and quiet though they were, began to shape the emotional landscape that would eventually lead to heartbreak. Even in the midst of these challenges, I clung to hope. Hope that moments of connection, shared laughter, and quiet attention could still make a difference. But deep down, I knew the truth I did not yet fully admit to myself. The seeds of estrangement had already been sown, and the consequences of my absence, distraction, and impatience were slowly beginning to take root. As the years went on, the small cracks became harder to ignore. They were still subtle, quiet, almost invisible to anyone else, but I could feel them in the air, in the way our home sometimes felt heavier, quieter, even when laughter echoed through the rooms. My son was growing up, and with growing came independence, curiosity, and, inevitably, frustration, and I didn't always know how to respond. I remember one afternoon when he asked me to help with a school project. I was tired from work, my mind full of deadlines and bills, and I sighed. Not now. I'll help later. His face fell in a way that made my chest ache, a mixture of disappointment and hurt that children carry silently. He didn't say anything, just walked away. I promised myself I would make it up, but later never came. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, a subtle wall began to rise between us. Our conversations began to change too. He would ask questions, seeking guidance, reassurance, or just a shared laugh, and I would sometimes answer absent-mindedly, distracted. I thought I was giving him enough, but I wasn't. And the gap widened not with dramatic arguments, but in small silences, missed opportunities, and moments of neglect that were almost invisible, yet profoundly felt. I remember sitting at the dinner table one evening, trying to make conversation. He responded with short answers, barely looking up from his plate. I asked about his day at school, and he mumbled a reply, eyes flicking to my wife as if seeking the validation I failed to provide. I felt a pang of guilt, but I didn't fully grasp the gravity of it. I thought it was a phase, something temporary. But these small silences were the beginnings of estrangement. Sometimes I would see him staring out the window, lost in thought, and I would feel a strange emptiness in my chest. I wanted to ask what he was thinking, what was on his mind, but I hesitated. I didn't want to push. I didn't know the right words. And when I didn't ask, when I didn't reach out, that distance grew a little more. Every unspoken question, every ignored glance, every moment I chose distraction over attention, built a subtle wall I could not yet tear down. I remember one rainy Saturday when we were supposed to spend the day together. I had promised him a trip to the library, but a work call came up at the last minute. I said, "We'll go another day, I promise," and he didn't argue. He just nodded and walked to his room, shoulders slumping slightly, a small but unmistakable expression of disappointment. I thought I could make up for it later, but life's demands always seemed to intrude. And in that intrusion, I realized something frightening. I was slowly losing my place in his life, not through a single mistake, but through 1,000 tiny ones. My wife noticed too. She would give me quiet looks, a subtle shake of the head when she saw him withdrawing, a gentle reminder. He needs you now, not later. I understood, but understanding is not enough. Action is what matters. And my failures were measured not in dramatic confrontations, but in missed opportunities, in moments where presence and attention would have built trust and connection, and I didn't seize them. There were small confrontations, too, moments when frustration bubbled over. One evening, he refused to tidy up his toys. I raised my voice, more sharply than I intended. "Clean up now," I said. He looked at me, eyes wide, startled, and muttered, "You don't care about anything I do." The words struck me, not because they were untrue, but because they were an echo of the distance I had allowed to grow. I tried to explain, to apologize, to soften the moment, but the damage was subtle, invisible, lingering. Even in play, the shift was noticeable. He would sometimes resist my suggestions, turn down my invitations to games, or wander off while I tried to engage him. It wasn't rebellion in the dramatic sense. It was a quiet assertion of independence, a reaction to subtle neglect, a reflection of small disappointments accumulated over time. And each of these moments chipped away at the bond we had once shared so naturally. I remember one evening when he asked if I would read him a story. I had been caught up with chores and said, "Later, I'm busy." He didn't argue. He didn't complain. He just put the book away and went to his room. Later that night, I tried to go in and read with him, but he was already asleep, a small, contented frown on his face that hid the disappointment of the day. And I realized, painfully, that love requires action in the present, not promises for the future. My wife and I tried to maintain our routines, our sense of normalcy, but the subtle tension began to seep into every corner of our home. Evenings that were once filled with conversation became quieter. Weekends that were once playful became punctuated by small disagreements, gentle irritations, and moments of distance. And through it all, I carried a growing awareness that my attention, my patience, and my presence were not enough to bridge the invisible gap forming between my son and me. I remember one Sunday when we all tried to bake together. My son struggled with rolling dough, my wife patiently guided him, and I tried to help too. But my impatience got the better of me, and I snapped, "Just do it right." His eyes welled with tears, and I immediately felt the sting of regret. We paused, tried to reset, but the moment had already left a mark. Small, invisible, but enduring. Even in these small conflicts, I could feel love lingering beneath the surface. He still wanted my attention, still wanted to share his thoughts and victories. He still laughed at my jokes occasionally, still ran to me with scraped knees. But those moments became less frequent, more tentative, as if he was learning that I might not always be there. And in that lesson, I failed. Not in a single moment, not in a dramatic scene, but in countless small, quiet ways that eroded trust, patience, and emotional connection. I would catch glimpses of him, standing by the window, staring at the rain, sitting quietly at the table, lost in thought, fiddling with a toy absent-mindedly, and feel a pang of fear and guilt. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but often didn't know how. I tried small gestures, but they felt insufficient, too late, like drops of water on a desert floor. Those days before the real conflict were filled with ordinary routines and ordinary love, but beneath it all, subtle tension was building. Misunderstandings, unspoken expectations, moments of impatience, and distracted attention were all quietly shaping the emotional landscape of our home. And though I did not yet understand it fully, I knew, deep down, that if these patterns continued, they could lead to heartbreak, loss, and the widening distance that I feared but could not yet face. And yet, even in these moments, hope lingered. Small glimpses of joy, connection, and laughter reminded me that our bond was not yet broken, that our love remained, however fragile it might be. I clung to those moments, even as I realized that love without consistent presence, attention, and care is a fragile thing, easily shaken and slowly eroded over time. By now, the subtle tension that had been growing in our home was no longer invisible. I could feel it in the air, in the quiet sighs, the hesitations before speaking, the glances that lingered a moment too long. Our home was still filled with love, still filled with laughter, still full of routines and traditions. But underneath it all, a quiet unrest had begun to settle in, almost imperceptible at first, but persistent, like the slow tick of a clock no one notices until it grows louder and louder. I remember one evening when I asked my son to help me with some chores around the house. He muttered an unenthusiastic, "Okay," dragging his feet across the floor. I could sense the reluctance, but I tried to ignore it, assuming it was normal for a child his age. Still, when I looked at his face, I noticed something subtle, a flicker of disappointment, a small crease in his brow, the way his eyes seemed distant. I realized then, more clearly than ever before, that he was beginning to withdraw, even in ordinary moments. Our conversations had become more cautious, less natural. He would answer questions with short replies, his voice lacking the spark of enthusiasm it once carried. He still wanted to engage, I knew that, but something had shifted. He had begun to measure my attention, testing whether I was truly present or merely physically there. And I could feel the weight of that test, a quiet pressure that reminded me that I was failing in ways that mattered more than I had ever imagined. One afternoon, he asked me to attend a small school performance, a simple recital with songs he had been practicing for weeks. I had a work commitment, a meeting I felt I could not miss. "I can't, buddy. I have to work," I said, and his face fell instantly. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He just nodded, a faint sadness in his eyes, and walked away. I remember standing there, feeling the pull of guilt, realizing that I had chosen work over him, over us, over moments that could never be reclaimed. My wife noticed too. She watched him retreat with a careful, protective concern. "He's noticing," she said softly, her voice almost breaking. "He sees when you're not there, when you're distracted. And it matters." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of shame, but I didn't fully grasp the depth of it yet. I thought I could make it up later, that small gestures could balance the weight of my absence. But those small gestures were never enough. Love requires consistency, presence, and attention, and I was giving it inconsistently, almost haphazardly. There were arguments too, small and quiet, that hinted at larger tensions. One evening, he refused to do a chore, not out of defiance, but out of quiet frustration. I raised my voice, asking why he was being difficult, and he said softly, "You don't care about what I do." The words, though simple, carried the weight of months of unspoken feelings, disappointment, hurt, and a sense of being unnoticed. I tried to apologize, tried to explain, but the words felt hollow even as they left my mouth. I noticed other subtle changes as well. He would sometimes avoid asking for help, trying to solve problems on his own, even when he struggled. He would hesitate to share stories or jokes, testing whether I was truly listening. And in those moments, I felt the growing gap between us, a silent, unspoken distance that was forming faster than I could repair it. There were moments of tenderness, of course. We still played games together, laughed at silly jokes, shared quiet evenings reading stories. But those moments were now punctuated by hesitations, interruptions, and a growing sense that the easy connection we once shared was slipping away. I tried to hold on to them, desperately, like grasping at water, but the current was strong, and I was slow to react. One evening, he came to me with a drawing he had made. He was proud, eyes shining, hoping for a smile, an embrace, a word of encouragement. I looked at it distractedly and said, "That's nice, good job," without really seeing it. His face fell slightly, a shadow of disappointment passing quickly, almost imperceptibly. But I felt it, deep down, as one of many small failures stacking up in my mind and heart. Even small routines, like bedtime stories or helping with homework, began to carry a quiet tension. He would sometimes resist, sometimes rush, sometimes glance toward my wife for guidance instead of me. I realized, painfully, that the bond we had built over years could erode in quiet increments, through absence, distraction, impatience, or unintentional neglect. And I felt helpless, because I did not yet know how to stop it. I remember thinking, during these moments, that life was moving too fast. He was growing up, changing, becoming his own person. And I was afraid that the distance we were experiencing now would grow into something permanent. Afraid that one day, I would look back and see a life I could no longer touch, a bond that could not be repaired. And yet, I still held on to hope, fragile and persistent, that love could survive even these small fractures. But deep down, I knew the truth I did not yet want to admit. Love alone is not enough. Attention, presence, patience, and understanding are what truly sustain a bond, and I had been inconsistent in all of them. Every missed opportunity, every distracted glance, every moment of impatience was a small fissure in the foundation of our connection. And though they seemed minor at the time, I could feel them accumulating, quietly shaping the future in ways I would soon regret. Even in the best moments, quiet evenings reading together, shared laughter at dinner, playful games on the weekend, there was an underlying tension, a subtle reminder that nothing in life is permanent. The cracks were growing, almost invisible, almost imperceptible, but insistent, stretching silently beneath the surface of love. And I knew that if I did not pay attention, if I did not act with intention, the consequences could be devastating. Those years before the real conflict were bittersweet, full of ordinary routines, love, and small joys, yet shadowed by subtle distance, quiet misunderstandings, and growing frustration. And as I look back now, I see clearly that the foundation we had built, strong though it seemed, was fragile, delicate, and vulnerable to neglect. Even now, I remember these days with a mixture of warmth and regret. Warmth for the love we shared, the laughter that still echoed in my mind, the small victories and quiet victories of connection. Regret for the moments I failed, the attention I withheld, and the subtle cracks I allowed to grow unnoticed. Those years, ordinary yet extraordinary, were the calm before the storm, a calm that would soon be broken by the rising conflict I was not yet ready to face. By this point, the quiet tension that had been simmering for years was becoming more visible. The subtle signs of frustration and distance had grown into small confrontations, moments of misunderstanding and unspoken disappointment. I could feel it in the air, in the way my son sometimes avoided eye contact, in the way he hesitated before speaking, and in the small sighs that seemed heavier than before. I remember one evening vividly. I had just returned from work, exhausted, expecting a simple greeting or a hug. My son was sitting at the table, quietly doing his homework. I asked him how his day had been, expecting the usual short answer or a shrug. But instead, he looked at me with an expression I had rarely seen: disappointment, confusion, and something like sadness. "You don't care about what I do," he said softly. The words hit me harder than I could have imagined. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him he was wrong, or dismiss it as a childish exaggeration. But I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he was right. That night, I lay awake thinking about the moment, replaying it over and over. I tried to rationalize it. I worked hard to provide for them. I came home every evening. I tried to spend time with him when I could. But rationalization did nothing to erase the guilt gnawing at my chest. Love alone was not enough. Presence, attention, understanding. These were the real building blocks of connection, and I had failed to provide them consistently. The next few days were filled with small, tense interactions. He would brush past me in the hallway, mumble a quick hello, instead of speaking freely, or retreat to his room without explanation. I tried to engage him, asking questions about school, friends, and hobbies. But the answers were clipped, distant, and guarded. Every attempt to reach him felt like stepping onto thin ice. One wrong word, one missed gesture, could shatter the fragile connection that remained. I remember a Saturday afternoon when we planned to go to the park. He seemed hesitant at first, dragging his feet, muttering under his breath. I tried to lighten the mood with jokes and encouragement, but the energy between us felt off, strained. Halfway through, he stopped, arms crossed, staring at the ground. "I don't want to go anymore," he said quietly. My heart sank. I tried to coax him, to understand, but he shook his head, and we went home in silence. That silence was heavier than any argument we had ever had, a quiet reminder that something fundamental had shifted. Even at home, the tension was palpable. Small chores became points of friction. Homework time turned into quiet struggles, where even minor corrections were met with eye rolls or frustrated sighs. I tried to be patient, but sometimes I lost my temper. One evening, I raised my voice over a minor mistake with a math problem. He looked at me, stunned, and whispered, "Why do you always get angry at me?" I froze, realizing that anger, even unintentional, had left scars. The words echoed in my mind long after he went to bed. My wife and I had quiet discussions about what was happening. "He's changing," she said, her voice tinged with worry. "And he's feeling neglected, even if you don't mean to." I nodded, knowing she was right. But knowing wasn't the same as doing. I still struggled to adjust, to slow down, to truly see him and respond in the way he needed. And the gap between us continued to widen. One night, I tried to bridge the distance with a small gesture, bringing home his favorite snack and asking if he wanted to watch a movie together. He agreed, but his enthusiasm was muted. He smiled, yes, but it wasn't the genuine excitement I remembered from years before. During the movie, he barely spoke, focused more on the screen than on me. I could feel the weight of his guardedness pressing between us. Even in moments meant for bonding, the distance was there. School events became another source of tension. He would invite me to parent-teacher conferences or performances, and I would commit to attending, only to have work or other obligations interfere. Each missed opportunity left a subtle mark, a silent message that my priorities were elsewhere. I saw the way he would look at me during these moments, a mixture of hope and disappointment, and my chest would tighten with regret. Even our bedtime routines, once a source of comfort, had changed. He would sometimes read on his own instead of asking me to read with him. He would lie awake silently, thinking, worrying, or processing emotions he couldn't yet articulate. I would lie beside him, feeling the distance, wishing I could reach him in a way that didn't require words. But the years of subtle neglect, distraction, and missed moments had built a barrier that was not easy to cross. One evening, after a minor disagreement, he retreated to his room and slammed the door softly. I stood outside for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of frustration and sadness. I realized then that these small conflicts, repeated over months and years, were shaping his perception of me. I wasn't just a father who made mistakes. I was a father who could hurt him without even knowing it. And that thought crushed me. The turning point of this segment came unexpectedly. One afternoon, he came home with a note from school. I glanced at it casually, expecting something trivial. But it was a message from his teacher, indicating that he was struggling emotionally, withdrawing from classmates, reluctant to participate, and quietly frustrated. Reading it, I felt a deep, hollow ache. I realized that the problem wasn't just minor miscommunications or small frustrations anymore. The distance had taken root in ways I could no longer ignore. I tried to speak with him gently that evening, sitting on the couch as he stared at the floor. "I saw your note today," I said softly. "I didn't realize. I'm sorry if I've been distant. I want to be here for you." He looked up briefly, eyes wary, and said, "It's too late sometimes, Dad." His words pierced me. I wanted to argue, to explain, to promise everything. But the truth was clear. The damage had been done, and I could feel the weight of every missed moment, every distracted glance, every unintentional hurt stacking up between us. And so, our home was now a place of quiet tension. Love remained, yes, but it was tempered by frustration, misunderstanding, and growing distance. Moments of joy were fleeting, overshadowed by the underlying weight of disappointment and unspoken emotion. I knew that if I did not change, the bond one had cherished might slip away entirely. Even as I write this now, I can still remember the heavy silence of our home in those days. The laughter that once echoed freely now felt hesitant. The small victories and playful moments were punctuated by pauses, sighs, and glances that carried more meaning than words. And in that silence, I began to understand a painful truth. Love alone is not enough to sustain a family. Attention, presence, understanding, and care are what truly matter, and I had failed to give them consistently. Those months were a turning point. The subtle cracks I had ignored, the small misunderstandings I had brushed aside, were now undeniable. Our bond was strained, fragile, and under threat. And I knew that the next steps, the choices I made, the actions I took, the patience I practiced, would determine whether we could repair what was broken or watch it unravel completely. The quiet tension in our home had begun to solidify into something more tangible. It was no longer subtle sighs or fleeting glances. It had become a pattern, a rhythm of avoidance, hesitation, and unspoken frustration. Every day seemed to carry a weight I couldn't lift. A sense that the bond one had nurtured for years was slipping through my fingers despite my love. One evening, it became painfully clear how much had changed. I had been trying to work late, and my son came into my office, holding a small drawing he had made. "Look what I made, Dad," he said, eyes shining with pride. I glanced up briefly and murmured, "That's nice," before returning to my work. I saw the disappointment flash across his face, a mixture of hurt, frustration, and resignation. He walked away quietly, and I felt a lump in my throat, a sting that didn't fade. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment, thinking of every small time I had dismissed him, brushed off his questions, or failed to be present. Every forgotten bedtime story, every missed school event, every rushed conversation formed a chain I could not ignore. The weight of regret pressed down on me, heavier than any punishment I had ever known. The next morning, the pattern continued. At breakfast, he barely spoke, quietly eating his cereal while glancing at the floor. I tried to ask him about his day, to engage him in conversation, but the responses were short, clipped, distant. "I'm fine," he said, and that one phrase carried more truth than any words I could offer. I realized in that moment that our communication had fractured, not because of a single incident, but because of years of small neglects and missteps. Schoolwork became another battlefield. I tried to help him with a math assignment, and he resisted my assistance, frustrated at my impatience. "Why don't you just understand?" I said, not realizing how my tone had grown sharp with stress and fatigue. He paused, looked at me, and whispered, "You never understand me, Dad." The words were simple, but they struck with the force of a hammer. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to explain that I was trying, but all I could do was stare, heart heavy, realizing that my attempts had often felt insufficient. Even my wife noticed the growing distance. "He's struggling," she said one evening, voice quiet and worried. "And he's blaming you, even if he doesn't say it outright." I nodded, feeling both frustration and despair. I knew she was right, but knowing was not the same as changing. And in my struggle to be both provider and father, I realized I had failed at the most important role of all, to be present, to listen, to guide, and to love in the small, everyday ways that children need. One weekend, I planned a family outing, hoping to reconnect. I suggested going to the park, playing games, sharing time together. He agreed, reluctantly, but his enthusiasm was muted. I tried to engage him, but his attention drifted, and his responses were short and automatic. I could feel the invisible wall growing between us with every step, every word, every pause. By the end of the afternoon, he barely spoke, retreating into his own world, leaving me with a deep, gnawing ache in my chest. I began to notice other subtle changes too. He no longer sought my approval for small achievements. He no longer ran to me with minor triumphs, jokes, or questions. Instead, he sought it elsewhere, from his mother, from teachers, from friends. I wasn't his first choice anymore, and the realization cut deeper than any argument or confrontation could. There was a particular evening that stands out in my memory, one that still makes my chest tighten. He had been practicing for a small recital at school, and I promised I would attend. A work emergency came up, and I had to step out. I told him I would watch the recording later. He looked at me, eyes wide, filled with hope and disappointment simultaneously. He didn't protest. He didn't yell. He just walked away quietly. That silence, that absence of confrontation, spoke louder than any outburst ever could. It was in that quiet moment that I began to see the full scope of the distance that had grown between us. Over the following weeks, things worsened. Homework sessions became fraught with tension. Conversations grew shorter, less meaningful. Even when I tried to show love through gestures, favorite snacks, movie nights, small gifts, they felt hollow, insufficient. He began to internalize the disappointment, and I could see it in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he avoided looking at me. He was still my son, yes, still loved me in some way, but a part of him had withdrawn, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and that part was growing every day. One night, I tried to bridge the gap. I sat on his bed and said softly, "I know I've missed a lot. I know I haven't always been here for you the way I should. I want to do better." He looked at me for a long moment, eyes wary, guarded. Then he whispered, "You don't know what it feels like, Dad." And with that, he turned away, pulling the blanket over his shoulders. I sat there in silence, heart heavy, understanding that words alone could not undo the years of subtle neglect. My wife watched silently from the doorway, her expression a mixture of sorrow and helplessness. "He's hurting," she said quietly, "and he doesn't know how to tell you." I nodded, unable to speak, realizing that our home had become a place of quiet suffering, of invisible wounds that would not heal easily. Even ordinary moments became tinged with tension. A simple game of cards, a family meal, or a walk in the yard could carry undercurrents of frustration and disappointment. He would answer briefly, sometimes sarcastically, sometimes with a quiet edge of irritation, testing boundaries and expressing emotion in the only ways he knew. And each time, I felt the growing gap, the invisible wall between us, and the helplessness that came with realizing that love alone could not bridge it. It was in these moments that I began to fear what the future might hold. I saw the slow erosion of trust, patience, and connection. I understood, painfully, that if I didn't act, if I didn't truly change, if I didn't learn to listen, to be present, to understand, the bond we had built over years could unravel completely. And that fear haunted me. The rising conflict had arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, but now it was undeniable. Love remained, yes, but it was strained, fragile, and tested. The small moments of connection were now interspersed with hesitation, frustration, and unspoken disappointment. I knew that the choices I made in the coming days, weeks, and months would determine whether we could heal or whether this distance would become permanent. And yet, even in this growing conflict, I held on to hope, fragile, tentative, but present. Hope that understanding, patience, and attention could still repair the subtle fractures that had formed. Hope that love, if accompanied by consistent action, could bridge the growing gap. But I also knew that the path ahead would be painful, that mistakes would compound, and that the heartbreak we were beginning to experience might leave scars that would take years to heal. By this stage, the quiet tension in our home had escalated. What had once been small silences, subtle hesitations, and missed opportunities for connection had grown into larger cracks, moments of frustration, misunderstanding, and quiet heartbreak. Every day seemed to carry the weight of these unspoken emotions, and I could feel the strain pressing against the walls of our home, our conversations, our lives. I remember a particular evening that still haunts me. My son had a small award ceremony at school, something he had worked hard for over weeks. I had promised him I would attend. That morning, though, an urgent work call came in, one I felt I couldn't miss. I explained to him, tried to soften the disappointment with words, "I'll watch the recording later. I'm so proud of you, I promise." He nodded silently, his eyes glimmering with a mixture of hope and resignation. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He simply went about his day, leaving me with a heavy, gnawing guilt that would not fade. In the days that followed, I noticed the subtle changes that marked deeper emotional distance. He no longer ran to me with small triumphs or shared jokes. He no longer sought my approval in ordinary moments. Even at dinner, conversations were clipped, polite but distant. He had begun to internalize the disappointment, the absence, the subtle neglect, in ways that were heartbreaking to witness. Homework sessions, which had once been moments of connection, had turned into tense negotiations. I tried to guide him through a project, but my impatience surfaced despite my best intentions. "Just do it like I said." I snapped once, more sharply than I intended. He looked at me, eyes wide, and whispered, "Why do you always get mad at me?" The words were soft, but they struck like a hammer. I wanted to explain, to apologize, to assure him of my love, but the silence that followed told me that the distance was no longer something we could bridge with a single conversation. Small arguments began to erupt more frequently, fueled not by anger, but by the weight of accumulated frustration. One night, I asked him to clean up his room. He hesitated, then muttered under his breath, "You never care about anything I do." I froze, the words echoing in my ears long after the moment passed. They weren't just complaints. They were a reflection of months, even years, of unmet emotional needs, small disappointments, and overlooked moments. I tried to respond calmly, but my voice wavered, and the tension thickened. Even ordinary moments became fraught. A simple game of cards, a family dinner, or a walk in the yard could carry undercurrents of anger, frustration, and unspoken disappointment. I noticed the way he avoided eye contact, the way he flinched slightly when I raised my voice, the way he sometimes withdrew entirely from interaction. Each of these signs was a reminder that our bond, though still present, was fragile and under threat. I tried desperately to find moments to reconnect. I suggested movie nights, small outings, and even quiet one-on-one talks. He would participate, yes, but his enthusiasm was muted, his words measured. I could feel the barrier between us, rising higher with each passing day, and I understood that it had been built not by a single act of failure, but by countless small ones. Missed events, distracted conversations, unfulfilled promises. The tension reached a peak one evening after a particularly rough day. I had been frustrated with work, distracted, and impatient. He made a minor mistake while helping with dinner, and I raised my voice more sharply than I should have. He froze, eyes wide with hurt. Then, softly, but with clear emotion, he said, "You don't care about me, Dad. You never do." Those words cut deeper than anything else I had heard. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the truth was undeniable. My absence, my distraction, my impatience, all had contributed to this moment. I sat there in silence, heart heavy, realizing the extent of the emotional distance I had allowed to grow. Even my wife noticed the growing strain. "He's hurting," she said quietly, watching him retreat to his room. "And he's starting to believe the words he says. Be careful." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down like never before. I realized that this was no longer about ordinary challenges or growing pains. This was about a bond fraying under the weight of neglect, distraction, and unintentional harm. Schoolwork, Extracurricular activities and ordinary daily interactions all became opportunities for friction. He was testing boundaries, expressing frustration in subtle ways, and I often reacted poorly, further widening the gap. I noticed the way he would avoid asking for help, the way he would seek approval elsewhere, and the quiet disappointment that lingered in his eyes. Every small act of withdrawal was a reminder that love alone could not repair years of neglect. One afternoon, after a minor argument, he retreated to his room and slammed the door softly. I stood outside, listening to the muffled sounds of frustration and sadness, wishing I could undo the past years of mistakes. I realized then that this rising conflict was no longer about daily inconveniences or ordinary misunderstandings. It was about a fracture in trust, a growing distance that could not be bridged with words alone. Even the moments meant for connection became fraught with anxiety. A walk in the park, a shared game, or a small gesture of love carried the weight of unspoken tension. I tried to reach him, to show him I cared, but I could see that my efforts were often insufficient, arriving too late, overshadowed by past neglect. And I began to understand, painfully, that the rising conflict was now shaping the very foundation of our relationship. By the end of this segment, it was clear that our family life was at a turning point. Love remained, but it was strained and fragile. The small moments of joy were punctuated by hesitation, frustration, and unspoken hurt. I could feel the pressure building toward an inevitable confrontation, a moment when the cracks I had ignored for years would demand attention, and when choices would need to be made, choices that could either heal the bond or allow it to shatter completely. And so, the rising conflict reached its peak in these months. The subtle tension, once almost invisible, had transformed into a palpable strain. Misunderstandings, disappointment, and small betrayals had compounded, leaving us all teetering on the edge. I knew, even then, that the coming weeks and months would test the limits of love, patience, and forgiveness, and that our family would be forced to face the consequences of years of neglect. Consequences that would leave scars, but also the potential for growth, understanding, and eventual reconciliation. The tension that had been building over months, even years, finally reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden beneath polite silences and half-hearted gestures. One ordinary afternoon, the moment arrived, sudden, sharp, and painful, when the reality of the distance between my son and me became undeniable. It started with a simple phone call from his school. "Your son has asked to speak with you privately," the teacher said, her voice gentle but serious. I was puzzled but tried to remain calm. "Of course," I replied. I didn't yet know that this call would change everything I thought I knew about our relationship. When I arrived at the school, my son was waiting in the hallway, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes wary. He didn't run to me, didn't smile, didn't hug me as he used to. Instead, he stood still, almost fragile, as if bracing himself for a confrontation he knew was coming. My chest tightened. I had known the distance between us had grown, but seeing it so clearly, in his eyes, in his posture, in the silence, made it feel real in a way I hadn't expected. He handed me a folded piece of paper. "Read it," he said quietly, almost too quietly. I unfolded it and began to read. The words were simple, honest, and cutting. He had been feeling abandoned, unnoticed, and unloved. He had been hurting silently for months, building up resentment and disappointment that I hadn't acknowledged. Every small failure of mine, missed events, distracted conversations, moments of impatience, was cataloged in his mind and heart. I felt a wave of guilt and sorrow wash over me. Each word he had written felt like a mirror reflecting every mistake, every moment I had overlooked, every failure to be present in the small but significant ways a father should. The paper trembled in my hands. I tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but the words felt hollow, insufficient, inadequate. He looked at me, eyes glistening, and said, "You don't know what it feels like to wait for someone who never comes, to hope for attention that never arrives. I tried to tell you, but you never listened." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet anguish, broke me in a way I could not have imagined. I wanted to reach out, to hold him, to say everything I had never said, but I feared my presence alone could not erase the years of silent hurt. That evening, we went home in near silence. The drive was long, filled with the weight of unspoken emotions. I tried to bridge the gap with gentle words, subtle gestures, and quiet encouragement, but he remained distant, cautious, and wary. Every smile I offered was measured, every word considered, because he had learned, through experience, that disappointment often followed hope. At home, I tried to make amends in small ways. I cooked his favorite meal, suggested we watch a movie together, and even offered to help with his schoolwork. He participated, yes, but the enthusiasm was cautious, hesitant, as though testing whether I could truly be present this time. I realized then that rebuilding trust would take far more than apologies. It would require consistent, patient action over months, perhaps years. The turning point didn't stop with just the note or the phone call. In the days that followed, other revelations surfaced, small truths my son had kept to himself, hidden frustrations, feelings of neglect, moments where he had internalized my absence as a lack of love. Each revelation cut deep, forcing me to confront not only my failures as a father, but also the fragility of the bond one had assumed was unbreakable. One evening, my son sat me down and said, "I don't want to fight, Dad. I just want to know you care." His voice was calm, almost adult in its composure, but beneath it lay a lifetime of hurt and longing. I wanted to tell him everything, that I had loved him every day, even when distracted, even when flawed, but the words seemed insufficient. Instead, I sat quietly, listening, absorbing, and promising myself that things had to change. That night, I lay awake reflecting on the years that had led to this moment. I realized that the turning point wasn't a single event, a single argument, or even a single failure. It was a lifetime of small moments, missed bedtime stories, distracted conversations, broken promises that had accumulated quietly, invisibly, until the weight of them became undeniable. And now, facing the consequences, I understood that change had to be immediate, intentional, and sustained. The turning point was not just in his words or his written note. It was in the silence that followed, the quiet moments of reflection, and the sober realization that love, no matter how deep, cannot compensate for neglect. Presence matters. Attention matters. Consistency matters. And I had learned this the hardest way possible, through the heartbreak of watching the person I loved most in the world withdraw from me, almost irrevocably. Even as the days passed, the weight of the turning point lingered. Every interaction, every gesture, every conversation carried the shadow of what had happened. I could feel the fragility of our bond, the need for deliberate effort, and the urgency of action. The quiet tension that had been rising for months had now reached a crescendo, forcing me to confront not only my failures, but also the potential for redemption. If only I could act with sincerity, patience, and unwavering commitment. That first major turning point, painful as it was, became the catalyst for reflection, change, and eventual growth. I could no longer ignore the consequences of my actions or inactions. I understood that rebuilding the bond with my son would not be easy, that it would require humility, patience, and consistent love. And I resolved, in that quiet, heavy moment, that I would do whatever it took to repair what had been broken, even if the journey would be long and fraught with pain. The days following the note from my son were heavy. Every morning I woke with a sense of dread mixed with urgency, a realization that the distance between us was no longer subtle, no longer something I could ignore. It had become a tangible weight pressing down on every interaction, every conversation, every quiet moment in our home. I tried to approach him gently. I made small gestures, breakfast in bed on weekends, helping with homework without rushing, sitting beside him as he read, anything to show that I was present. But even these gestures, well-intentioned as they were met with caution. His trust had been tested repeatedly over the years, and now every act of mine was under scrutiny. One evening, he spoke directly. "Dad, why did you never notice?" His voice was calm, but each word carried years of suppressed hurt. "Why didn't you care enough to notice when I needed you?" I felt my throat tighten, tears threatening. I wanted to tell him that I had always cared, that I had loved him every day, even when distracted, even when busy. But the truth was clear. My actions had not reflected my intentions. The love I felt had not been enough to prevent the slow accumulation of pain. The first real confrontation happened one night after a minor argument about chores. I had reminded him to clean his room, and he had muttered something under his breath about me never caring. I snapped, my patience fraying, and he looked at me squarely. "You never cared about the little things," he said, voice cracking. "The bedtime stories, the games, the talks. You were never really there." I froze, the weight of his words pressing into me. There was no denying them. Every missed opportunity, every distracted glance, every moment I had prioritized work over him had contributed to this moment. I wanted to explain, to justify, to beg forgiveness, but I realized that words alone could not heal what had been broken over years. I could only sit, listen, and absorb the weight of the emotions he was finally able to express. That night, I understood fully that the turning point had arrived. The subtle cracks of the past had widened into a chasm, and bridging it would require more than love. It would require presence, humility, patience, and unwavering commitment. In the following days, more truth surfaced. My son began to open up, cautiously, about feelings he had buried for years. He spoke of moments when he had needed attention and found only distraction, when he had hoped for guidance and received impatience, when he had tried to share joy and received indifference. Each revelation was a blow to my heart, but I could not shy away. I listened, held back tears, and promised silently to do better. Even my wife, who had always been my partner in parenting, was affected. She watched the interactions with a mixture of sorrow and concern, knowing that the emotional distance had grown far deeper than I had realized. "He's hurting," she said softly one evening, "and it's because he's learned to expect disappointment." I nodded, knowing she was right, and realizing that rebuilding this trust would take more than apologies or short-term effort. The first major turning point climaxed when my son refused to participate in a family activity we had planned for weeks. I had organized a small picnic, hoping to reconnect, to show that I cared, to make amends. He sat silently, arms crossed, staring at the ground. I tried gently, "Come on, let's have some fun," but he shook his head. "I don't think you really want me there," he said quietly. The words cut deeper than any rejection I had ever felt. It was no longer about missed chores or forgotten school events. It was about the fundamental question of my presence and care in his life. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I thought about every moment I had overlooked, every opportunity one had squandered, every time I had chosen work, distraction, or convenience over my son. The weight of my failures pressed down, suffocating, relentless. I knew that if I didn't act now, if I didn't commit fully, patiently, and sincerely, I might lose him forever. It was during this period that I realized the turning point was not just a single moment. It was a series of moments, notes, confrontations, refusals, revelations, each adding to the understanding that things could not continue as they had. I also realized that the only way forward was not to dwell in guilt or despair, but to take responsibility and act consistently, even when progress was slow or imperceptible. Slowly, the first steps of reconciliation began. I started leaving small notes of encouragement, asking questions about his day, and really listening, not just waiting for my turn to speak. I sat with him during homework without offering correction unless asked. I began to notice small signs of his willingness to re-engage. A smile, a shared joke, a question answered with interest rather than hesitation. These were fragile moments, yes, but they were enough to show that hope was still possible. Yet, the heartbreak lingered. Every smile was tempered by caution, every shared joke by a memory of absence. He was testing me, measuring my presence, evaluating whether my words matched my actions. And I knew he was right to do so. Trust, once broken, does not return easily. Love, however deep, must be proven through action, consistency, and patience. By the end of this segment, the house had changed. The rising conflict had reached its apex, forcing all of us, my son, my wife, and me, to confront the consequences of years of neglect and distance. The turning point was no longer an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing reality, shaping every interaction, every word, and every choice. And it was clear that from this moment onward, everything would be different. Even as I write this now, I remember the quiet tension of those days, the weight of words unspoken and truths finally expressed, and the fragile hope that began to emerge. The turning point had arrived, painful but necessary, and it marked the beginning of a journey toward understanding, repair, and the possibility of healing the bond one had so nearly lost. The days following the earlier confrontations were heavy with unspoken tension. Our home had become a place of quiet reflection, each glance, each pause, each small gesture carrying the weight of what had been said and what had been left unsaid. My son's distance was no longer subtle. It was tangible, etched into the rhythm of our daily lives, a constant reminder that the bond we had once shared had been fractured. One afternoon, everything changed. It started with a phone call from his school counselor. "Your son has requested to speak with you privately," she said carefully. I felt a pang of anxiety, the kind that grips your chest and makes every heartbeat heavy. I nodded quickly, promising I would come immediately. Something in her voice, calm, professional, but tinged with concern, told me this was serious. When I arrived at the school, he was waiting outside the counselor's office, hands fidgeting, eyes downcast. He didn't run to me, didn't smile, didn't offer even a small gesture of affection. He stood there, still and wary, as if bracing himself for a storm. I could feel the distance that had grown over months, the cumulative effect of every moment I had prioritized work over him, every glance I had failed to offer, every promise I had broken. He handed me a folded envelope. "Read it," he said softly, his voice betraying the tension he had been holding inside for months. I unfolded the paper and began to read. The words cut deeper than anything I had experienced in years, confessions of hurt, frustration, and feeling abandoned. Each line cataloged moments where he had longed for my attention and guidance, only to be met with distraction or absence. Each word was a reflection of my failures, small and large, that had gone unnoticed until now. I wanted to respond immediately, to reach out and hold him, to assure him of my love. But I realized that no words, not promises, not explanations, could erase the weight of years of neglect in a single moment. I simply listened, absorbing every word, every sentiment, every quiet plea for recognition and care. Later that evening, at home, the atmosphere was tense and fragile. We sat together at the dinner table, the usual sounds of conversation replaced by careful silence. I tried to engage him gently, asking about his day, offering small stories about my own experiences. He responded, yes, but cautiously, measured, almost testing whether I was truly present. Every word, every gesture, every glance carried the weight of scrutiny. Then came the first real emotional breakthrough. After dinner, he asked me to sit with him in his room. He pulled out a notebook, filled with drawings, writings, and small notes he had created over the months. Expressions of joy, sadness, frustration, and longing. As he showed me each page, explaining the emotions behind it, I realized the depth of what I had missed. These were not just artworks or scribbles. They were windows into his heart, into the feelings he had struggled to communicate. "I tried to tell you," he said softly, "but I didn't know how. I thought you wouldn't listen." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the vulnerability he had been holding back. I wanted to say everything at once, that I loved him, that I had failed, that I would do better, but the words came slowly, humbly, with the weight of sincere regret. "I hear you now," I whispered. "I see you. I promise I will try harder. I will be here, really here, from now on." The turning point crystallized in that quiet room. It wasn't a single moment of anger or confrontation. It was a quiet acknowledgement of failure and the willingness to begin repair. I saw, in his eyes, both caution and hope, the fragile beginnings of trust slowly rekindling. It was clear that the path ahead would be long, that healing would require patience, consistency, and daily effort. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of possibility. That night, I stayed beside him longer than usual. We talked about small things, school, friends, hobbies, nothing monumental, yet each word was significant. Every shared story, every laugh, every moment of connection was a brick laid carefully to rebuild what had been broken. I realized that the turning point was not about grand gestures, but about presence, attention, and genuine engagement, the things I had failed to provide consistently before. The following days were a mixture of progress and setbacks. Some interactions went smoothly, others were punctuated by hesitation or frustration. But each small success reinforced my resolve. I began leaving notes for him, asking questions, listening intently, and responding thoughtfully. He started to open up more, cautiously, testing whether my actions matched my words. Each smile, each shared joke, each moment of attention was a small victory, a reminder that the bond could be healed if I remained patient and persistent. Even my wife noticed the change. She watched quietly, her expression softening with relief as she saw the beginnings of reconnection. "It's a start," she said one evening. "It won't be perfect, but at least you're here." I nodded, knowing she was right. Presence was the first step. Understanding and trust would take longer, but at least we had begun. By the end of this segment, the turning point had become undeniable. The rising conflict had forced confrontation, acknowledgement, and vulnerability. The hurt was still present, but the willingness to repair, to act with intention, and to listen had shifted the course of our relationship. The emotional climax of this turning point was not about a single dramatic incident, but about the quiet, sincere effort to understand, to empathize, and to rebuild a bond that had been strained for too long. Even now, I remember the fragile hope that emerged in that period, a hope built on honest conversation, quiet listening, and patient attention. The turning point had arrived, painful but necessary, forcing me to face the consequences of neglect and to take the first steps toward healing. And it was in this space, between heartbreak and hope, that I began to understand what it truly meant to be a father, to be present, consistent, and unwavering in love, even when the path is difficult and the scars run deep. After the pivotal confrontation and the revelations that followed, the atmosphere in our home began to change, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. The tension that had weighed heavily on every interaction began to lift in small ways, though the scars of past neglect were still visible. Each day became a delicate negotiation between hope and caution, a testing of whether the promises of attentiveness and care could be sustained. The first change I noticed was in the small moments. My son began seeking my attention, but cautiously. A question about schoolwork, a request for help with a drawing, or a shared comment about a game on TV became opportunities to reconnect. These gestures were tentative, but they carried enormous meaning. I responded with patience, listening carefully, showing genuine interest, and allowing him to lead the pace. One evening, he invited me to sit with him while he worked on a school project. He didn't speak at first, focused intently on his work. I sat quietly beside him, offering guidance only when asked, watching him process, create, and engage. After some time, he looked up and said softly, "Thanks for helping, Dad." The words were simple, but the tone carried trust, acknowledgement, and a fragile hope that our connection could be restored. I realized then that the turning point was no longer a single moment of revelation or confrontation. It was a series of consistent, small actions. Patience, presence, and genuine attention began to heal wounds that had festered over years. I started leaving notes for him, small messages of encouragement, reminders that I was proud, and expressions of love. He read them quietly at first, then smiled, then eventually responded, leaving notes of his own. Our conversations began to change as well. Before, every interaction was tinged with caution, frustration, or unspoken tension. Now, dialogue became a bridge, a slow but steady pathway to understanding. He began to open up about his feelings, sometimes hesitating, sometimes with fear, but gradually with more confidence. I listened without judgment, validated his emotions, and made sure my responses reflected the care I intended. One particularly meaningful moment occurred when he invited me to join him in the garage. He had been working on a model car, meticulously painting, assembling, and adjusting every piece. I knelt beside him, asking questions, offering guidance, and sharing in his excitement. For the first time in months, the joy we felt together seemed genuine and unguarded. Laughter returned, subtle at first, then more freely, filling a space that had been heavy with silence. Even ordinary routines began to take on new significance. Meal times became moments of conversation, walks around the neighborhood were opportunities to share stories, and small errands were no longer just chores, but chances for connection. I realized that rebuilding trust and love was not about grand gestures or dramatic apologies. It was about showing up, every day, fully and consistently. Despite these improvements, the scars of the past were still present. Sometimes he would withdraw, hesitant to trust my presence, or respond with cautious politeness instead of genuine enthusiasm. I reminded myself to be patient, to respect his pace, and to continue demonstrating reliability through consistent action. Each small moment of trust earned was a step forward, each setback a reminder that healing is not linear. My wife noticed the subtle changes too. "He's responding to you differently now," she said one evening, observing us working together on a small project. "He's still cautious, but he's trying." Her words encouraged me, reminding me that persistence and sincerity could make a difference. It wasn't immediate reconciliation, but it was progress, fragile, yet real. One day, my son approached me with a small notebook. Inside were drawings and short writings he had created over the past weeks, some expressing joy, some reflecting struggles, and some showing gratitude. He handed it to me quietly, saying, "I wanted you to see what I've been feeling." I looked through each page carefully, recognizing the effort, thoughtfulness, and vulnerability. I felt tears well up as I realized that he was beginning to trust me again, sharing his world in ways he had withheld for years. These moments, though seemingly minor, were powerful. They represented the first genuine steps toward rebuilding a bond that had been strained by neglect, distraction, and miscommunication. I began to understand that fatherhood is not measured by grand gestures or perfection, but by consistent presence, empathy, and attentiveness to the small, everyday moments that matter most. Evenings became times for quiet reflection and intentional connection. We would sit together, talking about school, friends, and shared memories. Sometimes the conversations were simple, almost mundane, yet each word, each laugh, each attentive gesture strengthened the fragile bridge of trust we were rebuilding. I realized that the turning point had not simply been the confrontation or the note, but the deliberate choice to act differently moving forward. By the end of this segment, the atmosphere in our home had shifted. The rising conflict had been confronted, acknowledged, and addressed through patient action and heartfelt attention. The turning point had set us on a path toward reconciliation, healing, and gradual restoration of trust. The process was ongoing, requiring effort, humility, and patience, but the first signs of hope and reconnection were unmistakable. In these days of quiet rebuilding, I began to see the true meaning of love and fatherhood, the recognition that even when mistakes are made, consistent care, presence, and listening can restore what was broken. The turning point had arrived, and with it came the possibility of repairing the bond one had almost lost. It was a fragile hope, yes, but it was real, and that was enough to guide me forward. The days that followed the turning point were quieter, gentler, yet still filled with a sense of purpose. The tension that had shadowed our home for months had begun to lift, replaced by a fragile hope that we could rebuild what had been broken. It was not a dramatic transformation, nor was it immediate. Healing, I realized, comes in small increments, moments, gestures, and words that slowly knit a bond that had been stretched and frayed over time. The first sign of progress was subtle. My son began to share his thoughts with me again, cautiously at first, then more openly. One evening, he came into the kitchen while I was preparing dinner. "Dad, can I help?" he asked softly, a small but meaningful gesture of connection. I smiled, welcoming his presence, and together we chopped vegetables, stirred sauces, and set the table. It was ordinary in every sense, yet extraordinary in its significance. These shared routines became our bridge. I made a conscious effort to listen, not to respond with instructions or criticism, but to simply hear what he had to say. I asked questions about his school day, his projects, his friends, and I listened without distraction, without judgment, without rushing. Slowly, he began to open up, sharing small frustrations, hopes, and triumphs. Each conversation, each shared laugh, each attentive moment became a building block, reinforcing trust and connection. One day, we sat together in the living room with a stack of books. I suggested we read aloud, taking turns sharing stories. He hesitated at first, uncertain whether he could trust the moment, but eventually agreed. As we read, I noticed him leaning in, engaging with the narrative, and then looking at me for acknowledgement. I offered quiet praise, celebrating his insight and imagination. That small interaction, repeated over days, became a symbol of our growing bond, fragile, tentative, yet undeniably present. Evenings became times of reflection, conversation, and shared activities. We played board games, worked on small projects, and took walks together. These moments, once routine and often taken for granted, now carried deep significance. Every interaction was an opportunity to show care, attention, and consistency. Every shared smile, every laugh, every exchanged word of encouragement reinforced the fragile trust that was slowly returning. My wife noticed the subtle transformations too. She would watch quietly as we interacted, a gentle smile softening her features. "He's responding to you differently now," she said one evening. "He's beginning to trust that you're really here." Her words encouraged me, reminding me that patience, consistency, and genuine attention were creating change, however gradual. There were still moments of hesitation. My son would occasionally withdraw, test boundaries, or respond with guarded words. I learned to accept these moments without frustration, understanding that rebuilding trust is not linear. Each step backward was temporary, each act of withdrawal a test, and each cautious interaction an opportunity to prove that my presence was genuine and lasting. One particularly meaningful day, he invited me to join him in his room while he worked on a school project. He had been designing a model city, meticulously constructing each building, road, and detail. I knelt beside him, asking questions, offering guidance only when requested, and sharing in his excitement. As we worked together, I saw the joy in his eyes, a joy that had been absent for months. He laughed freely, shared ideas, and even taught me a few things about his project. In that moment, the past months of tension, conflict, and heartbreak felt a little lighter. Small gestures continued to reinforce our connection. I began leaving short notes of encouragement in his backpack, reminding him that I was proud of him, that I loved him, and that I was always available to listen. He began responding with little notes of his own, expressions of gratitude, drawings, or even a simple, "Thanks, Dad." These small exchanges, though minor in appearance, carried immense emotional weight, symbolizing a growing willingness to reconnect and rebuild trust. The turning point had taught me that reconciliation is not achieved through grand apologies or dramatic gestures, but through the steady accumulation of small, consistent actions that show care, attention, and presence. Each moment mattered, each gesture mattered, and each shared experience became a step toward healing the fractures that had once seemed insurmountable. By the end of this segment, our home had begun to feel different, quieter in tension, fuller in possibility. The rising conflict that had defined our daily life was no longer the central force shaping our interactions. In its place, cautious hope, tentative connection, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding trust had begun to take root. I understood that the journey was far from complete, that setbacks would occur, and that patience and humility would remain essential. But for the first time in months, I felt the possibility of a restored bond, of a father and son slowly finding their way back to one another. In this early stage of resolution, I began to see the true depth of responsibility and love. Love is not merely a feeling. It is action, patience, and consistency. It is being present when it matters most, listening when words are few, and responding with attention and care. These lessons, learned through heartbreak and confrontation, became the foundation upon which I would continue to rebuild, day by day, moment by moment. The weeks that followed the early steps of reconciliation were quiet but profound. Our home, once heavy with tension, had begun to breathe again, carrying the light of small but meaningful interactions. My son's cautious openness became more frequent, and each moment we shared felt like a brick laid carefully to rebuild a bond that had once seemed irreparably broken. One of the most powerful signs of progress came during a weekend when he invited me to join him on a project he had been working on for months. He had created a small model of a park, complete with miniature trees, playgrounds, and benches. I knelt beside him, asking questions, sharing ideas, and letting him lead the process. He explained each detail with pride, his voice carrying a quiet excitement that reminded me of the boy I had known before the distance had grown. "What do you think about adding a fountain here?" I asked, pointing to a blank space in the model. He considered it, then nodded. "Yeah, that would be perfect." Together, We worked for hours, laughing quietly when mistakes were made, celebrating each small success. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic, but in its simplicity, it was perfect. This was trust being rebuilt, patience rewarded, and love expressed through shared time and attention. We began establishing new routines, small rituals that reinforced connection. Every morning, we would share a brief breakfast together before the day began, asking about plans, projects, or feelings. Every evening, we would spend a few minutes talking about the day, not as a formal check-in, but as a way to genuinely connect. I realized that these ordinary moments were extraordinary in their ability to heal the fractures of the past. Even ordinary tasks became opportunities for bonding. Grocery shopping, fixing things around the house, or walking the dog became shared adventures. He would teach me tricks he had learned in school, and I would offer advice, guidance, and stories from my own childhood. Each interaction reinforced trust, patience, and understanding, gradually erasing the hesitation and distance that had dominated our lives for so long. One evening, as we were preparing dinner together, he spoke softly, almost hesitantly. "Dad, thanks for being here. I mean really here." His words, simple and unassuming, carried the weight of months of longing, disappointment, and gradual healing. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I swallowed them, letting my voice reflect sincerity rather than overwhelm. "I'm here, and I'll keep being here. I promise." That promise was no longer just a statement. It had become an intention, a daily commitment backed by action. We also revisited shared hobbies that had once connected us before the distance grew. Board games, bike rides, and reading together became joyful rituals rather than obligations. These moments, filled with laughter, curiosity, and conversation, reminded us both of the bond we had shared and the possibility of rebuilding it even stronger. My wife watched the transformation quietly, her expression softening with relief and hope. "He's opening up again," she said one evening. "You're doing it differently this time." I nodded, understanding that presence, consistency, and patient attention were the key. Healing is not instant, but it is cumulative, each moment of connection adding to the foundation of trust, care, and love. Despite progress, challenges remained. There were moments of hesitation, frustration, and testing. He would occasionally retreat, not out of anger, but from caution, a natural response after months of disappointment. I learned to respect these pauses, to remain patient, and to continue showing that my actions matched my words. Consistency, I realized, was more important than immediacy. One particularly meaningful moment occurred during a quiet evening in the living room. He picked up an old photograph of us at the park when he was younger, smiling widely as I held him on my shoulders. "I remember this day," he said softly, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. I smiled, feeling the warmth of the memory. "I remember too. We had so much fun that day." For a moment, the years of distance and pain seemed suspended, replaced by a simple, heartfelt connection. These moments, repeated over days and weeks, became the rhythm of our healing. We learned to communicate openly, to share small joys and frustrations, and to listen without judgment. Slowly but surely, the bond that had been stretched to its limits began to mend, strengthened by patience, effort, and the shared recognition of past mistakes. By the end of this segment, the resolution was no longer just a possibility, it was unfolding in real time. The father-son relationship, once strained and fragile, was regaining its footing. The past was acknowledged but no longer allowed to dominate the present. Love, attention, and presence were becoming the central forces in our daily lives, guiding every interaction, every shared moment, and every gesture of care. This segment closes with a sense of quiet hope. The turning point had passed, the hardest moments confronted, and the process of reconciliation underway. The journey was far from over, but each day brought new opportunities for connection, understanding, and healing. In this period of resolution, I began to see the true meaning of fatherhood, the courage to face one's failures, the humility to listen and change, and the patience to rebuild a bond one deliberate, heartfelt action at a time. The weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, the connection between my son and me grew stronger. What had been fragile and tentative slowly became resilient, built not on dramatic apologies or grand gestures, but on consistent attention, patience, and shared experiences. I learned that real reconciliation doesn't come from a single event. It comes from countless small moments that demonstrate love, presence, and understanding. One afternoon, he invited me to join him in the backyard, where he had been working on a small garden project. Rows of carefully planted seeds, labeled and tended with care, reflected not only his attention but also the trust he was beginning to place in me. I knelt beside him, asking questions about each plant, offering guidance, and learning from his observations. Together, we watered the seedlings, adjusted the soil, and shared quiet laughter when one plant leaned awkwardly or a weed had grown where it didn't belong. In those quiet moments, I realized the significance of presence. Being there mattered more than any words I could have said. Listening mattered more than trying to explain myself. And small, consistent actions mattered more than grand gestures or sudden declarations of love. Each shared experience, each laugh, each attentive response became part of the slow, deliberate reconstruction of our relationship. We began revisiting routines that had once brought us joy but had been neglected. Evening walks, board games, and simple storytelling sessions became daily rituals. My son gradually spoke more openly about his feelings, his challenges, and his accomplishments. I listened without judgment, responded with encouragement, and allowed him to set the pace. With each passing day, I noticed subtle changes. The way he looked for my attention without hesitation, the way he smiled more freely, the way he shared ideas and stories without caution. One evening, while sitting together over a shared project, he said softly, "Dad, I'm glad you're really here now." The words, simple as they were, carried immense meaning. They acknowledged the past mistakes, the emotional distance, and the pain we had endured, while also celebrating the effort, presence, and attention that had been rebuilt. It was a moment of quiet triumph, one that could not be measured in grand displays, but in the sincerity of connection. Even ordinary tasks became opportunities for bonding. Cooking meals together, running errands, or fixing small things around the house transformed into moments of shared purpose. He taught me tricks he had learned in school, and I shared stories from my own childhood. These moments, ordinary yet meaningful, strengthened the trust and understanding that had been fragile for so long. Through it all, I reflected on the lessons this journey had taught me. I had learned that love is not enough on its own. Presence matters. Attention matters. Consistency matters. And patience is essential, especially when repairing a bond that has been strained by years of neglect. I began to understand the depth of responsibility inherent in fatherhood, not just to love, but to act in ways that make that love tangible and reliable. There were still challenges, moments of hesitation, and small setbacks. Sometimes he would retreat, not out of anger, but from caution, a natural response after months of disappointment. I learned to accept these moments without frustration, understanding that trust, once broken, requires time and patience to rebuild fully. Every day, every small interaction was a chance to demonstrate reliability, care, and unwavering presence. One day, we sat together quietly, looking at a photo album of our past adventures, family trips, birthdays, simple afternoons at the park. He smiled softly as he pointed to images of himself as a small boy, laughing, exploring, and learning. "I remember this," he said, eyes glistening. "I forgot how much fun we had." I nodded, feeling the weight of memory, regret, and renewed connection. "Me too," I said, "and I want us to make many more memories like this." This segment highlighted the essence of resolution: quiet, deliberate, and consistent efforts that rebuild trust and love. Our relationship was no longer defined by conflict or absence, but by intentional presence, meaningful attention, and the slow accumulation of shared experiences. Healing is rarely instantaneous, but when approached with patience, humility, and sincerity, it becomes possible. By the end of this segment, the bond between father and son had moved from fragile reconciliation to meaningful connection. The emotional tension that had once dominated our home had given way to understanding, laughter, and shared purpose. We had faced the consequences of past neglect, acknowledged our mistakes, and chosen to rebuild, not perfectly, but with intention, care, and love. The lessons I carried from this stage were profound. I had learned that forgiveness requires time, that trust is earned through consistent action, And that love is measured not in grand declarations, but in presence, patience, and attention to the small, but significant moments of life. The journey toward reconciliation had been challenging, sometimes painful, but ultimately transformative for both my son and me. The months that followed were quiet, steady, and filled with moments that slowly stitched together the fabric of our relationship. I had come to understand that reconciliation is not about erasing the past, nor about forgetting the mistakes that caused distance. It is about being present, consistently and sincerely, and proving through actions, not words alone, that love is real, patient, and enduring. There were mornings when he would come to the kitchen, his hair still messy from sleep, and ask to help with breakfast. We would laugh as we scrambled eggs, trying not to burn them, and I would watch him learn not only the practicalities of cooking but the small, shared rhythms of connection. I realized that these ordinary moments held extraordinary value. They were proof that presence and attention could heal the invisible scars of neglect. We celebrated birthdays, school achievements, and small victories together, and I made a conscious effort to honor his feelings, encourage his creativity, and participate fully in his world. Sometimes it was just sitting together, listening to music, or talking about dreams and hopes. Other times, it was helping with homework, fixing a broken bike, or planning a weekend adventure. Each action was intentional, each moment a demonstration of care. There were still reminders of the past, moments when he hesitated, moments when old frustrations surfaced, moments when the weight of absence lingered. But these moments no longer defined our relationship. They were small waves on a calmer sea, reminders that healing is a process, not an instant transformation. Every setback became a lesson in patience, humility, and understanding. One afternoon, we sat together looking at a family photo album. The images captured years gone by, birthday parties, park outings, and quiet afternoons reading together. He looked at a picture of himself as a young boy, perched on my shoulders, smiling broadly. "I remember this day," he said softly. "I forgot how happy I felt." I smiled, feeling the weight of memory, regret, and gratitude. "Me too," I said, "and I want us to make many more memories together." In those moments, I realized that the true essence of fatherhood is not perfection, but presence. It is not about grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but about showing up consistently, listening deeply, and nurturing trust through attention and care. Love is measured in actions, not just intentions, and rebuilding a broken bond requires time, patience, and humility. As the days passed, I noticed a subtle shift in both of us. Conversations became more natural, laughter returned more freely, and shared experiences were no longer cautious or tentative, but filled with genuine joy. We began planning small trips, exploring new hobbies, and celebrating the ordinary moments that make life meaningful. The bond between father and son, once strained and fragile, had grown stronger, tempered by struggle, effort, and sincere connection. Reflecting on the journey, I understood that the turning point, painful as it had been, was necessary. Without confrontation, without acknowledgement of hurt, without the courage to face failure, there would have been no opportunity for growth, understanding, or healing. Pain had brought clarity. Distance had revealed the value of presence. Absence had taught the importance of attention. These lessons, though learned through hardship, became the foundation for a deeper, more resilient bond. I also reflected on forgiveness, both his and mine. Forgiveness does not erase the past, nor does it make mistakes disappear. It lightens the burden of carrying resentment and allows space for connection and growth. My son had learned to forgive my past neglect, and I had learned to forgive myself for failing in the ways I once thought were insignificant. Together, forgiveness became the bridge that allowed us to move forward. There were quiet moments of reflection too, late at night, when the house was still and the world felt distant. I would sit alone, thinking about the mistakes I had made, the lessons I had learned, and the path ahead. I realized that fatherhood, like life itself, is never perfect. It is a series of choices, moments, and actions that define who we are and the relationships we cultivate. The journey is ongoing, but the willingness to act with care, presence, and empathy determines whether bonds break or endure. I began to see the value of small gestures more clearly than ever. A smile, a note of encouragement, a shared story, a quiet presence. These ordinary actions carry extraordinary power. They communicate love, care, and attentiveness in ways that words alone cannot. And when sustained consistently over time, they have the ability to heal wounds, rebuild trust, and create lasting connection. As I watched my son grow, learn, and laugh, I felt a quiet pride and deep gratitude. The journey had been painful, yes, but it had also been transformative. I had learned to be present in ways I had never understood before, to listen with patience, to act with intention, and to cherish the ordinary moments that define life and family. Our bond was no longer fragile. It was real, resilient, and alive. In the end, I realized that life's lessons are often delivered through hardship, that love requires both intention and action, and that reconciliation is possible even after years of distance. My son and I had navigated heartbreak, confrontation, and reflection, and together, we had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected. As I look back now, I carry these truths with me. Love is shown through presence, patience, and care. Trust is rebuilt through consistent, intentional action. Forgiveness does not erase mistakes, but it allows healing. The smallest moments, a shared laugh, a gentle gesture, a quiet conversation, hold immense power. And finally, I understand that even after mistakes, even after neglect, even after pain, it is never too late to reconnect, to act with love, and to rebuild what has been broken. My son and I are proof of that truth. We have walked the long path from distance to connection, from heartbreak to hope, from silence to trust. And in this quiet, heartfelt resolution, I have found peace, understanding, and the enduring joy of being present in his life, truly present, every day, in the moments that matter most.